Brooklyn, 1979, liked to pretend it was taking a nap. The kind of nap that involved 2 radios on the counter, a back door that stuck in summer, and a neighbourhood that knew more than it told. On Knickerbocker Avenue, closer to the border where languages traded elbows, Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant sat like a friendly witness. Its awning had sunburn, its brick had history, and its sauce had a memory longer than most marriages. By lunchtime, the regulars had learned to fold their conversations instead of finish them. Somebody's cousin was definitely doing great at construction. Somebody else's uncle absolutely didn't know anything about anything. The city hummed, the ice melted, and the service came with bread. On this day, Carmine Galante walked in wearing the sort of confidence that wrote its own invitation. He carried a cigar the way some men carry umbrellas, ready for any weather, but mostly to make a point. Newsprint called him many things, sometimes even to his face. The neighbourhood called him something simpler and spoke from behind the curtain. He took a seat in the courtyard out back, because even power likes sunshine. The walls rose close and high, a little square of sky perfectly framed like an expensive painting. A checkered tablecloth and a metal chair did their best to look unremarkable. Lunch arrived in the order the day demanded: mozzarella with tomatoes, something fried because it would be wrong not to, a plate of pasta, and the layered sermon of a salad that never converted anyone. The cigar stayed where it belonged, a punctuation mark between sentences, a period, or perhaps an exclamation mark depending on the headline you preferred. He set it down beside the dish like a second fork. Smoke curled. The air tasted like summer and garlic, and the kind of silence that makes itself comfortable. Across the street, a tailor pretended to be intensely interested in hemming, which is what you do when the street suddenly becomes a library and all the books don't want to be read. A woman with a paper bag paused at the corner to argue with the price of oranges, and then decided the argument could wait. The neighbourhood, cooperative as ever, rotated into soft focus. Inside the restaurant, Joe and Mary's continued its honest work. A server ricocheted between tables with the casual grace of someone who had long ago learned to never repeat a joke out loud. The chef, who would tell you he knew nothing about news and even less about the people who walked past the kitchen door, stirred the sauce and pretended the simmer didn't sound like a clock. Carmine ate with the patience of a man who had learned that victory rarely required speed. He spoke to his companions in a tone so same you could level a shelf with it. Names were used the way you use hot pans, with care and mitts. Laughter showed up like a polite guest and stayed exactly as long as it should. A breeze wandered into the courtyard and flipped a napkin corner. Someone said the espresso here could forgive sins. Someone else said sins were doing just fine without espresso. The neighbourhood, overhearing both, chose to be Switzerland. On the street, a car idled too long, as cars do when they are thinking hard about whether they belong. Across the way, a pair of young men leaned on a mailbox as if they'd been born there, discussing sports in the universal dialect of people not discussing anything at all. One of them wore sunglasses typical of a man who liked his future dim. A bus rolled by and left behind the stale breath of the city. A delivery truck stopped, discovered it was in the wrong place, and then decided to be in the wrong place with commitment. The driver hopped down, swore maternally at a dolly that had opinions, and noisily rearranged the map of his day. Inside, a phone rang and someone answered quickly, because this was a place where phones were supposed to be answered quickly. The receiver's voice said, "We're all out of trouble today, come back tomorrow," and then asked whether the caller wanted meatballs or sausage. Carmine's companions had that particular posture of men who considered their chairs temporary. They laughed at the jokes they were supposed to laugh at, nodded at the sentences that expected nods, and allowed the afternoon to walk itself like a well-trained dog. If there was a worry in the room, it was polite enough to dress like patience. He lifted the cigar again, examined the ash like an oracle, and let the smoke draw a line the sunlight couldn't cross. It was the kind of gesture that acts like a signature. By the time he set it back down, the day had decided its shape. People in neighbourhoods like this know a lot about weather. Not the polite kind with umbrellas and forecasts, but the other kind weather that shows up in pairs, drifts through doors, and uses first names it didn't earn. There is a temperature to a block, a barometric pressure you can feel in your fingertips if you've ever had reason to count doors in a hurry. The pressure dropped. From the kitchen, someone shouted for basil, as if volume could improve flavour. The server cut through the courtyard with a tray, a short prayer balancing on each plate. A fly made career choices near the olives. The city kept breathing. At the fence that made a boundary of the air, shadows arranged themselves with the kind of courtesy that seems suspicious in hindsight. A neighbour leaned out her window with a cloth and a reason, and then closed whatever she had opened, because the street had asked nicely. There is always a minute you can point to, later, when you say it was still a regular day, then it wasn't. The back door, which had lived a long life of refusing to cooperate with humidity, didn't make its usual argument. It moved as if the afternoon had oiled it. Men stepped through with the unremarkable competence of people who have practiced being ordinary. The city adjusted its glasses. What happened next is reported, retold, argued, footnoted, and otherwise organized in filing cabinets that smell like dust and ink. The essentials are widely known: the courtyard, the sunlight, the table, and the sudden presence of men who didn't come for the specials. The specifics, out of respect for YouTube and appetite, will be the gentle version. There was motion the way thunder is motion visible, but mostly heard. A chair scraped back as if it wanted the lead in a play. Someone said a name that was not necessary, as if names were shields. The air, which had been perfectly happy to mind its business, found itself busy with sound. When life becomes a headline, it rarely asks for permission. The courtyard that had admired the sky now admired velocity. The napkin that had flipped earlier committed to the bit and tried flying. A bottle rolled, stopped, and remarked on how quickly afternoons can change careers. After the loudness, there was the other thing, kind of quiet that looks around to see who is still in the room. It took attendance. It marked a change. Carmine was suddenly a man the city would talk about in past tense. To phrase it the way broadcasters do when they want the dinner hour to keep its appetite, he was made unalive. The cigar, which had been doing its best work as punctuation, lay where it had been set, expressing itself with smoke and a certain tragic humour. Someone yelled something urgent in a language that belongs to kitchens and emergencies. The server caught a plate that had not asked to be involved. One of the companions attempted a sentence and lost interest after the second word. The city, whose heart rate was familiar with aerobic activity, moved to a different tempo. Across the street, the tailor finally put the needle down. He closed his shop sign with more enthusiasm than the sign deserved, and chose not to rush, because rushing says things about you that you might not want on your resume. The woman with the paper bag remembered she had somewhere else to be. The oranges held their price. The men who had entered with professionalism left with the same. The door resumed its habit of complaining a second too late. In the courtyard, someone whispered a prayer that preferred privacy, while another person found a chair suddenly heavier than chairs generally are. News travels the way heat travels, everywhere, then particularly. The block learned quickly, the neighbourhood learned faster, and by the time anyone used the words authorities out loud, the city had already added a new layer to its legend. A radio said something official, in a voice that had practiced all the vowels of calamity. The chef, who had known the clock was ticking without admitting it, found himself stirring a sauce that no longer matched the day. The server set a glass of water on the table, because doing something normal is how you argue with the universe. Galante's cigar gave its last smoke like a professional, finishing a set. It made a small column that went et, broke, and joined the sky it had been trying to draw all afternoon. It left a smell that didn't apologize. People would later describe the sunlight. It was too bright, or not bright enough. It was golden, or pitiless. It made everything sharp or everything soft. The witnesses disagreed on adjectives the way poets do, which is to say, confidently, but most agreed the afternoon kept its colour. The city rarely goes black and white, even when it should. In the first hour after, the street performed its rituals. A bystander announced he had warned everyone not to do whatever it was no one had planned to do. Another swore he recognized someone he couldn't possibly have recognized. A teenager decided this was the day he would stop skipping class. The mailbox men vanished, replaced by a dog who had nothing to add. Sirens approached with the righteous music of paperwork. Uniforms appeared that had not been on the rack in our other story, and they did what uniforms do, measured things, asked questions, drew circles around facts, and tried not to be impressed by the setting. Reporters began to gather, pulled by instinct and caffeine. They had adjectives in their pockets and questions that could be rearranged to suit outcomes. Cameras blinked like owls in daylight. One of the microphones had tape on it that declared a station nobody remembered. A detective with a face you could use to sand a table took a long look at the cigar. He didn't pick it up, he didn't need to. He wrote something down that sounded like a sigh. In the kitchen, a cook stared at his hands as if they'd been borrowed. He removed an apron, folded it carefully, and placed it where type couldn't reach it for a minute. Another employee stacked bread like small, square witnesses. The owner, who had always believed in the restorative properties of lunch, found himself briefly out-argued. The block did what blocks do absorbed. The sun moved like it always does, immune to plot twists. A bus returned, pretending not to remember the place. A delivery driver considered getting it right this time and then parked exactly where he had before, because people are consistent even when the world isn't. By late afternoon, stories had begun their migration from fact to version. The words allegedly and reportedly earned overtime. Televisions at appliance stores practiced their synchronized solemn nods. Phones rang in places where phones were supposed to ring, and the city found new ways to say it had seen a lot, but not this. Not exactly like this. Carmine's name moved through the boroughs with the gravity of a heavy coin. Everyone had a take, some had two. Old loyalties stirred. New opportunities checked their hair in the mirror. There are tides you can't see until your feet get wet. Night promised rain, or maybe it just promised to think about it. Joe and Mary's would close its door with a softness that meant respect. Tomorrow, someone would scrub at the concrete as if it could forget. Someone else would bring flowers and the right kind of silence. The detective finished his first round of questions in the way carpenters finish a first cut, knowing there would be more. He looked once more at the chair that had scraped too loudly, then at the sky that had stayed politely framed. He allowed himself one thought. Power always looks permanent until the chair moves. Across the street the tailor switched off the light and stood in the quiet. He tried to recall the shape of the afternoon before it learned a new word. He failed, because days do not go backward, and neighborhoods remember the way water remembers a stone, by changing around it. As darkness arrived, the cigar's last perfume still announced itself like a rumor that refused to die. The city, practical as ever, filed the day where it files such days, under the letter that stands for both legend and lesson. If you walked past Joe and Mary's that evening and didn't know, you might have thought it just another restaurant after a long day, a chair still slightly crooked, a napkin that had stopped trying to be a bird, a bottle that had nothing left to say, the kind of stillness that only comes after thunder. And if you did know, if the names were not just words but weights, you might have felt the block lean, just a fraction, as if it had adjusted to the absence of a man who had taught gravity a trick or two. The day the cigar went out was not a headline yet. It was just an hour that refused to behave. The night took it in and promised to keep it loud. Authority in New York likes to dress in contradictions. It will tell you to keep your voice down and then speak in headlines. It will insist on order and then wave traffic through a symphony of honks. In certain circles, authority wears cologne and a napkin ring. It votes by rumour and records minutes in eye contact. By the evening of the courtyard incident, there were already versions circulating like flyers without dates. Some versions insisted inevitability, others leaned on surprise, and a few, more honest, admitted that both can fit in the same suit. The phrase "the green light" crept into conversation the way a cat does, quietly, like it owned the place. Carmine Galante had been many things to many people, but temporary was not a word he endorsed. He had spent years cultivating the sort of fame that shows up even when uninvited. The cigar helped, but it wasn't the whole story. His reach had troubled a ledger far beyond one borough, and ledgers, historically, are vindictive. The rumour, as rumours like to style themselves, said that South and West had called North and East and arranged a logistics problem. The headline versions called it a decision. The participants, most of whom would never be caught near a headline, called it balance. In a private dining room uptown, earlier than anyone would later admit, a few older men had eaten linguine con vongole and practiced the art of being unphotographable. The window looked out at a street that pretended it didn't know how expensive it was. The waiter wore a tuxedo that had survived more history than some countries. "You cannot run an orchestra," said one of the elders, "if someone insists on playing the trumpet during the violin solo." He did not specify the instrument names because even metaphors have to be careful. He used his fork to point at a bowl in a way that suggested the bowl had been out of line. Another man, who had the posture of a statue plausible for a small plaza, nodded slowly. "Winds have shifted," he said, which is a polite way of admitting that a storm had been invited to dinner. "The boy in the hat wants to conduct." That boy, the first corrected, is not a boy. He wiped the corner of his mouth with a napkin that had listened to confessions. He is a spotlight. They ate quietly for a minute, as if the clams had requested respect. Someone poured wine with an economy that said the bottle cost more than certain opinions. "Balance," said the statue. "We have had balance, then suddenly there is a stair where there used to be a floor." He shook his head like a building refusing to sway. You can't have a man who forgets he is part of a sentence. They did not say the name in that room, not because they feared it, but because names changed the temperature of air, and they preferred their air room temperature. The waiter refolded a napkin with the attention you give to a knot. Elsewhere, in a club where the carpet remembered too much, a younger group rehearsed the modern version of tradition. Pureed music, veal that thought it was famous, and a booth that had opinions about loyalty. "If it comes from upstairs," one man said, tapping the table with a ring that had nearer relatives than he did, "then who are we to object?" "If it comes from upstairs," another countered with a smirk, "it will also come with a bill." He smiled at the thought and then at nothing. "But be my guest to object. I'd love the company in the lobby." The first raised his glass. "To balance," he said, "and to the wisdom of the elevator." He did not explain the joke. He didn't need to. Elevators, in this line of work, are metaphors with cables. Some people go up, some go down. The box keeps moving. Across the river, in a kitchen that smelled like fennel and whispered favours, a man with a penchant for clean sleeves flipped a calendar and decided June was a suggestion. He listened to a radio that pretended to be music and then turned it off. "If the city wants quiet," he told the empty room, "it should not schedule fireworks." His phone rang once. He answered on the second ring because punctuality is persuasive. The voice on the line said a number and nothing else. He repeated the number back and hung up. He washed his hands, carefully, as if the faucet were grading him. Meanwhile, in the neighbourhood that had given up trying to be surprised, Joe and Mary's spent the next morning moving slowly, as if the air had to be taught how to behave again. A mop made loops like signatures, chairs edged into neatness. Someone brought lilies because lilies always get invited to the second day. A city official arrived, practiced concern, and left with a sigh that would poll as bipartisan. A pair of plainclothes visited, wrote question, and learned little. The chef tasted the sauce, pronounced it the same, and then admitted that nothing was. The word green light grew bolder. It visited backrooms, found opinions, and collected interest. It explained to anyone who would listen that sometimes a family meeting is not a party, and sometimes democracy is best expressed by absence. Our detective, man with the sandpaper face, had an office that didn't believe in windows and a desk that did. He pinned a photo of the courtyard on a corkboard that had stopped being surprised in 1968. Thumbtacks found work. String, mercifully, stayed in the drawer. He disliked the theatre of yarn. Visitors to his desk learned the same three truths. He didn't take bribes, he didn't take jokes until afternoon, and he didn't take kindly to people confusing coincidence with deduction. He stared at the photograph and let it stare back. "You want a theory?" asked his partner, a man whose wardrobe argued for simplicity and whose hairline agreed. "Here's a free one." They voted. He lost. They collected. The detective grunted. His grunts had footnotes. "Votes leave footprints," he said, "but this city walks in sand." Still, the partner continued, "You don't get a courtyard opera like that without permission from the upstairs balcony." He gestured vaguely toward Manhattan, where balconies are plentiful and opinions are free. Otherwise you get a street brawl and bad press. "We got both," the detective said. "We just don't know whose tailor paid for the suit." He picked up a report and read the way a carpenter checks a level. The words said what words always say, approximately. Times and places waltzed politely. Descriptions overlapped like enthusiastic Venn diagrams. Somewhere in the pile was truth. It had misplaced its name tag. He wrote 2 names on a legal pad that had been waiting years for him to write these 2 names. He tapped the pencil twice and then didn't circle anything, because circles belong to conclusions, and he was not in the mood. Reporters did their part. A headline managed to use brazen without laughing. Columnists deployed metaphors like confetti. One radio voice referred to organized disorganization, which is how poets describe management. But in rooms without microphones, the mood was practical. Territory doesn't administer itself. Someone had to count trucks, arrange introductions, soothe tempers, and make sure the next Sunday passed without commentary from the evening news. A city is not a poem, it's a calendar. At a bakery in Williamsburg, a meeting took place over cannoli. 2 men and a woman, the kind of trio that never appears in official minutes, discussed the future as if it could be braided. "We'll keep the roots," the woman said, with the authority of someone who'd driven all of them. "We'll shift the weekends." "And the quiet tax?" asked one of the men, a question that can ruin dessert. "Same rate," she said. "Different cashier." They nodded, which is how policy is made. The baker dusted sugar like weather. Across town, a priest who knew how to be discreet lit a candle and decided not to ask why. He had a parishioner with the habit of confessing in euphemism and another with a talent for denial. The candle did its work, which is to stand there and burn as if that were enough. In a dented sedan cruising the BQE, 2 men who were not philosophical discussed the concept of vacancy. "You take out the boss," said the driver. You don't leave the chair empty. Someone trips over it. You put velvet rope around it, said the passenger, considering the skyline like an equal. Makes them want it more. They laughed in the way that passes for cardio in certain professions. The car merged with traffic, like a well-behaved live. Back in Bushwick, the block adjusted its mirrors. The tailor steamed a jacket with new industry. The grocer discounted peaches because even drama has to eat. A kid on a BMX recreated siren noises with beautiful inaccuracy. Joe and Mary's decided on a soft reopening, under the sort of hush a church uses when storms walk past. The door admitted neighbours who spoke softly to one another, as if words might bruise. A table in the back corner remained empty by consensus. No sign, no plaque, just absence with seating for 4. The server who had balanced prayers on plates the day before took orders with the kind of gentleness usually reserved for porcelain or widows. She moved as if the floor had changed grade and a misstep might roll the day downhill. A man arrived late, middle-aged, careful haircut, a suit that apologized for itself. He did not sit. He stood at the threshold and removed his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it circled back to sincerity. "I'm sorry for your trouble," he told the owner, and then left without eating. The gesture weighed more than a meal. Phones kept ringing in the background of lives. Some were answered, some were not. Messages stacked like plates. A cousin in Florida called to say he'd seen something on television. He had not, because Florida gets everything half an hour early in spirit. The detective made his own calls, to people who apparently never slept, and received answers shaped like fog. He visited a union hall and asked about schedules. He visited a flower shop and asked about deliveries. He did not announce his questions to the air because the air in New York has a gossip column. A pattern began to make itself presentable. Nothing as crude as a straight line, more like a curve that had taken a class in posture. In the weeks leading up to the courtyard, shipments had behaved like shy dancers. Introductions had been rerouted, meetings had been demoted to whispers. The city's circulatory system had braced for surgery. He wrote coordination on the pad and underlined it, then immediately regretted underlining because it was a commitment. He added a question mark to soften the marriage. At dusk, he walked the block. He disliked walking crime scenes after the fact. It always felt like asking a theatre to perform the show again with the audience gone. But he did it because sometimes pavements have confessions in their cracks. He looked at the courtyard wall and thought about windows. He looked at the door and thought about hinges. He looked at the table and thought about punctuation. A kid on the stoop asked, "You the guy on TV?" "Only if your TV is broken," the detective said. The kid considered this. "My TV is broken." "Then yes," the detective said, and kept walking. Meanwhile, the phrase green light reached people who preferred traffic signals to metaphors. Drivers at the docks learned that schedules had miraculously unclenched. A dispatcher discovered serenity, which in his line of work was a diagnosis. The city's machinery resumed with the economy of a well-rehearsed shrug. Upstate, a house with lawn furniture performed its role as a retirement community for men who pretended not to work. On the porch, a figure with a newspaper he didn't read said to another figure with a newspaper he couldn't admit he read, "Balance." They didn't cheers, they weren't savages. They nodded to the horizon, which had not participated, but enjoyed the credit. In a midtown bar where politics went to take off its shoes, an elected official practiced the art of never hearing anything suspicious. A lobbyist explained that things had calmed down, as if things had been agitated before. New York, he said, smiling with the part of his mouth that got him invited to fundraisers, prefers a lid. By the week's end, the narrative had hardened like caramel. They had been a decision. Nat in one room, not with one gavel. but in that loose confederation of interests the city calls a process. The man with the cigar had been declared incompatible with the quiet the calendar required. The light changed colour. Movement followed. None of this brought the detective any closer to names he could use in court. He compiled a list anyway. It was long and careful, and doomed to require erasing. He looked at it the way a man looks at a ladder leaning against a cloud. He did have thing. A whisper that the chair would not stay empty. 2 candidates were already being measured for it, neither willing to sit until the upholstery stopped smoking. Who? His partner asked, making it sound like the simplest question in the world. Depends, the detective said. On who calls which cousins? Cousins, his partner said, as if pronouncing a flavour he disliked. The detective closed his notebook. In this city, he said, everyone's related to the problem. He left the office late, hungry, and morally opposed to vending machine dinners. He walked into a diner that had cracked vinyl and coffee that forgave. The waitress looked at him like a returning character from a show she didn't watch but respected for longevity. You look like a man who wants a story to end, she said, dropping a menu he didn't need. I'd settle for a comma, he said. She poured coffee with the grace of a verdict. Good news, she said. This place is nothing but commas. He ate eggs at an hour that claimed it wasn't egg time. He thought about the cigar, about the door that hadn't squeaked when it should, about the men who practiced ordinary like a profession. He thought about balance and bills, elevators and velvet ropes, and the way a city decides to inhale after it has held its breath. Outside, rain finally kept its promise. The streets glossed over, signs reflected themselves like actors admiring mirrors. A bus sighed. Somewhere, someone raised a glass to someone they wouldn't toast in public. Somewhere else, someone made a call they'd rehearsed all day. Back in Bushwick, the block accepted the rain as a plausible apology. Joe and Mary's darkened its windows and locked the door with care. The empty table in the back corner kept being empty, which is a kind of memorial the city understands. In a walk-up apartment nearby, a woman folded laundry and told the television that people should learn to eat at home. The television agreed. It showed a photo of a courtyard, and then something about the weather. She shook her head, not at the crime, but at the forecast. They never get it right, she said. And in a car parked on a quiet block not far away, 2 men sat in silence and watched a doorway that had not yet learned it was important. They didn't talk because sometimes professionalism is the absence of conversation. They waited because waiting is a currency. The city provided the soundtrack. Rain, tires, a neighbour's laugh, and the deep, patient hum of ledgers balancing themselves. The green light had done what lights do. It had changed behaviour without raising its voice. People moved. Some stayed still. Power reallocated itself with familiar efficiency. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the detective finished his coffee and decided to start asking the kinds of question that make phones ring after midnight. Because for all the talk about votes and balance and orchestras, there's always a small, stubborn corner of truth that refuses to be institutional. It lives in the detail that didn't get rehearsed, the hinge that didn't squeak, the napkin that tried to fly. He put money on the counter, tipped like a man who wants good news later, and stepped back into the rain. The city, relieved to be itself again, opened a fresh page on the calendar and wrote in neat letters, "To be continued." New York doors have personalities. Some are gossips that rattle at every breeze, some are stoics that pretend winters don't exist, and a rare few are actors, quiet on cue, noisy when the plot requires it. The back door at Joe and Mary's had always been a talker. On the day it needed to, it decided to be shy, which, in detective language, is called interesting. Morning brought the city's apology for last night's rain. Streets rinsed, air combed, a sky pretending it had turned over a new leaf. The block resumed the choreography of delivery trucks, rolling gates, and conversations that all started with "anyway." Joe and Mary's opened with a hush you could fold napkins in. Our detective arrived with coffee strong enough to fix furniture and a tape measure that had seen more crime scenes than birthdays. He nodded to the owner, who nodded back, with the gravity of a man who had become a landmark overnight. "Back door?" the detective asked. "Back door," the owner said, as if naming a suspect who wouldn't lawyer up. The courtyard was a quieter version of itself, like a stage after the audience has left. The same small square of sky, the same walls performing stoicism, a table repositioned by caution, a chair that had decided to behave. Only the quiet felt permanent. He set the tape measure down, tested the door, and listened. Nothing. No complaint, no rasp, no signature squeak. The hinge turned like it had attended finishing school. "It sticks in summer," the owner said, defensive on behalf of wood. "Always has." "Yesterday was summer," the detective said. He bent close, as if the hinge might whisper a confession. Somebody taught it manners. The owner frowned. "We didn't touch it." "Someone did," the detective said, gently, in the tone of a man telling a child that magic tricks have fingers behind them. He examined the screws. They wore the slightly stripped look of recent attention. The hinge itself gleamed with a film too thin to see, but not too thin to smell. He put his nose close. "Graphite," he said. "Or a friend." He squatted, checked the jam. Fresh scuffs at knee height, the shy signature of a man who had tested the swing before the show. The strike plate had a new scrape. The deadbolt's face bore the polite polish of a key that didn't hesitate. "Would you ever oil it?" he asked the owner. "We threaten it," the owner said. "Does that count?" The detective smiled without committing. He stood, taking in the whole frame. Door, hinge, latch, the little universe of entry and exit. He touched the handle with a gloved finger, because manners matter in both restaurants and investigations. Somebody did rehearsal, he said, and they liked the acoustics. Inside, he traced the path from kitchen to courtyard. Narrow corridor, tile that remembered every shoe, a swinging door that apologized after you bumped it. He stopped at the phone mounted on the wall, looked at the cord, and followed it down to where it joined the base with a fresh piece of tape. He peeled back a corner and found nobody's idea of accident. The screw heads on the jack had been disturbed. "Lines are lines," he murmured. "Wires have cousins." He put the receiver to his ear and dialed the station. The connection sounded fine, which in his experience meant nothing. He hung up, made a mental note to ask people with tools and patience to say the word tap with confidence later. The kitchen staff moved around him with the wary grace of people avoiding a puddard they couldn't see. He checked the back alley garbage cans behaving, a cat conducting an inspection, a gate latch looking innocently ordinary. He measured prints in the grime. Boots, different sizes, different days. On the brick near waist height he found the faintest smudge of dark that wasn't weather. He scraped it. Graphite again. "Practice," he said. "Because amateurs improvise, professionals rehearse." He called his partner over. The partner arrived with a notebook and a face that doubled as a putty knife. "Door's polite today," the detective said. "Yesterday it wasn't." "Somebody bribed it," the partner said. "Somebody made sure it didn't testify," the detective corrected. He pointed out the hinge, the scuffs, the graphite, the phone. The partner wrote, which is what partners do in the long moments between breakthroughs and coffee. "Inside job?" the partner asked, because questions like to wear simple suits at first. "Inside cooperation," the detective said. "There's a difference. A kitchen gives a lot of secrets by accident. but this took intention. Time in the alley, time with the door, time with the phone. And none of the neighbours complained about somebody tinkering behind the restaurant because New York has learned to mind its business. He walked the block again, this time with a purpose that made sidewalks confess. He stopped at the tailor's, whose front displayed a mannequin that had seen eras come and go and preferred winter. "You hear anything odd day before yesterday?" the detective asked, leaning on the vowel that makes people answer. "Odd," the tailor said with the innocence of a professional listener. "This is New York. Odd is the house wine." "The door next door," the detective said, "used to squeak." "Oh," the tailor said, in the tone of a man remembering the name of a cousin at a wedding. "Not that day. Quiet. Like church. See anyone behind there with tools?" The tailor considered. "A kid with a hat," he said, then shook his head. "No, hat is wrong. Hair like a hat." He moved like he had no time and all the tie. "Jacket?" "Blue. Navy. The honest kind." "Gloves?" "Maybe." He kept his hands like secrets. "Alone?" "Not alone," the tailor said softly, as if refusing to tattle on gravity. At the corner bodega, the owner remembered a delivery truck that blocked the alley for an unconvincing amount of minutes. "New guy," the owner said. "Didn't know how to back up, or knew too well." He shrugged the city's shrug. The detective wrote the plate down, not because plates tell the truth, but because sometimes they tell a joke you can use in court. He called it in. The plate belonged to a truck that belonged to a company that was no longer at the address it belonged to. The phone number belonged to silence. He stopped by the payphone on the corner and stared at the gum fossils at the base like a paleontologist. He fished a coin from his pocket, spun it, and let it decide whether the call he was about to make should be called a favour or a transaction. It landed on edge and leaned against possibility. He made the call anyway. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who fixed things that shouldn't break. "Door oil," the detective said. "Graffiti." "Graffy's polite," the fixer said. "Won't sing in the cold. Dries clean. Good for the kind of job that wants the door to forget it's a door." "How long does the politeness last?" "Long enough to make a point," the fixer said. "Not long enough to get caught if you're smart. Couple days, maybe a week, depending on weather and whether anyone notices the door got manners." "Thanks," the detective said. "If you were rehearsing, how many drafts?" "One to make a friend," the fixer said. "One to check the friendship. One for showtime." He hung up and looked at his partner. "At least 3 visits," he said. "Maybe more." The alley was not unoccupied, which means the block saw things it will only admit in weather reports. They canvassed. They asked the kind of questions that seem harmless until your pulse answers them. A grandmother watering a tomato plant confessed to nothing and everything in the same sentence. A teen who should have been at school recalled a navy jacket that wasn't heavy enough for the day. A dog walker remembered being hurried along by a man who needed the sidewalk to himself for precisely 20 feet. The detective added the details to his mental mosaic: oil, door, phone, truck, jacket, hurry. He stepped back. The picture still looked like a picture from too close. At the precinct, he requested a phone tech to visit Joe and Mary's and do what techs do: nod at wires, mutter in Latin, and deliver a verdict in syllables. He filled out the form that would be ignored by everyone except the clerk who loved forms. He thanked the clerk as if the world were run by clerks, which, to a surprising degree, it is. His partner returned with photocopies from the DMV that smelled like heat and bureaucracy. "Your truck," the partner said, "belongs to a ghost." "Ghosts pay cash," the detective said, "and they don't mind late fees." He drew a slow circle around the word practice in his notebook. He added, in careful script, "If rehearsals were local, permission was regional. Then he looked at the sentence and decided it was something a professor would admire and a jury would ignore. He crossed out regional and wrote big. Afternoon light cut through the blinds at his desk and made stripes on the mess. He pinned a new photo, a close-up of the hinge, oil laughing at seriousness. He pinned the truck's plate. He pinned a sketch of the alley with arrows pointing to places where men become shadows. His board looked like Reason trying to remember a dance. His phone rang. The tech from Joe and Mary's. "Line was clean yesterday," the tech said, in a tone that implied lines usually weren't. "Clean today. But I can see where someone had curiosity cables wrapped around it last week. Neat work. Polite. The kind of curiosity that doesn't overstay. Listening or cutting?" "Listening," the tech said. "Very attentive listening." He thanked the tech and hung up. He stared at the board, at the picture of the door, at the number for the truck, at his own handwriting, which looked more confident than he felt. The green light had been a decision. The door that didn't ring had been a memo, circulated, initialed, filed. Someone had ensured the day would unfold with no bump, no squeak, no warning. That meant coordination. That meant planning. That meant a meeting somewhere with coffee and a map and someone pointing at a line and say, "Here." He decided to go looking for the map. Maps in this city live in warehouses that pretend they're apartments and offices that pretend they sell insurance. He went to one of the latter, where the carpet smelled like decisions and the receptionist's smile had a non-disclosure agreement. He asked for a man who collected trucking routes the way other men collect stamps. "He's out," the receptionist said, the national motto of logistics. "I'll wait," the detective said, the national anthem of persistence. He didn't have to wait long. The man arrived with a tie that had walked a dog and a haircut that had opinions. The detective showed him the plate number. The man's eyes did the arithmetic of disappointment. "That company is an umbrella," the man said. "It covers a lot of weather." "Who holds it when it wipe?" The man looked at the plate again, then at the detective, then at the receptionist, who was engaged in the high art of not listening. He wrote a name on a sticky note and slid it across. It was the kind of name that doesn't appear on plaques but does appear on checks. "Where do I find the person attached to this?" the detective asked. "Where you find shadows at noon," the man said, "under something tall." He left with the sticky note and the feeling that the map had twitched. He walked past the receptionist and felt the exact moment she decided to remember none of this. He respected her professionalism. On the street, he let the city's noise carry him a block, which is how New Yorkers decide direction. He stopped at a newsstand where the proprietor knew him well enough to offer a headline discount. He bought gum instead. He called his partner. "We have a name that thinks it's weather," he said. "Umbrella?" "Parasol," the detective said. "Shadier." They met at a diner that specialized in eggs and the art of never asking why two grown men are eating pie at 3 in the afternoon. They spread the sticky note between the sugar and the check. The name looked innocent, which is how names look when they want to be guilty. "You ever notice," the partner said, "how in this city the door that doesn't squeak is the one that gets you?" "Doors are honest," the detective said. "It's the hinges you watch." "And the men who bring the oil," the partner added. They drank coffee that had already given its best years to other cups. They divided tasks the way men divide chores, unequally and without resentment. The partner went to find the address under the stickiness of the note. The detective returned to Bushwick, because sometimes the answer stays where you left it and pretends it's brand new. The block had warmed up to afternoon. A saxophone practiced somewhere high, turning scales into weather. The tailor's sign squeaked like an honest door. The bodega's cat performed a sweep. A boy practiced jump shots with a ball that believed. He stood at the back door again and closed his eyes. He visualized 3 visits, one to oil, one to test, one to perform. He pictured the truck blocking the alley, the men moving past it like punctuation moving past a sentence. He pictured gloved hands on a handle, a hinge remembering not to sing, a phone line listening, a door opening on cue. He opened his eyes. The city did not applaud, it rarely does, but it allowed him one small gift. A neighbour, old enough to ignore instructions, shuffling down the alley with a bag of recyclables and the freedom of retirement. "You're the cop," the neighbour said, identifying him with the accuracy of gossip. "On my better days," the detective said. The neighbour nodded at the door. They were polite. "The ones who came before," the neighbour said, as if discussing a choir. "They said, 'Pardon us, sir,' and they moved around 'ee like I was a lamppost. One of them held the door for 'ee. Can you imagine, in this city, holding the door in an alley?" What did he look at life? "Hats," the neighbour said, then reconsidered. "Hair like hats, the kind of hair you keep combs for. And the shoes. They didn't squeak either." He smiled at the memory of manners. Polite. "Did you tell anyone?" "Who would I tell?" the neighbour said, lifting the bag as if it contained the answer. "People don't like polite men in alleys unless they're carrying groceries." "Did you see a truck?" "Oh yes," he said. "It apologized to the alley by being in the way." The detective thanked him and watched him go. He wrote polite in his notebook and underlined it twice. Polite men in alleys, polite doors, polite oil. The city was being very courteous about a very discourteous act. He returned to the precinct, sat at his desk, and let the day collect itself. His partner walked in at sunset, with the look of a man who had found an address, and then discovered it had moved just before he arrived. "Name belongs to an office that belongs to a building that belongs to the sky," the partner said. "No receptionist. Just a floor with more carpet than sense, and 3 locked doors that don't squeak." Polita, the detective said. "Very," the partner said. They looked at the board in silence, 2 men listening to a crime scene clear its throat. The hinge gleamed. The truck plate stared back, lawless. The alley sketch pointed inward as alleys do. "Next?" the partner asked. "Next we find the rehearsal space," the detective said, "where polite men practice being invisible. And if we can't, then we settle for the man who sold them the oil," the detective said, with a half smile. "Sometimes the hinge sings a name." He turned off his desk lamp and let the city's evening take over the room. Outside, headlights stitched lines across the windows. Somewhere, a church bell negotiated with traffic. The night smelled like wet brick and ambition. On his way out, he detoured past Joe and Mary's. The door, traitorously smooth, opened without comment. Inside, the owner was mopping the same square twice, as if repetition could turn back kite. The detective raised a hand. The owner nodded. Words would be too heavy for the floor. He paused at the courtyard. The chair sat properly. The table accepted its duty. The air had settled, as air does after it has been bossed around. He looked at the slice of sky framed above and let the city know, silently, that he was not done asking it questions. Because a door that forgets to squeak isn't quiet. It's telling you a story. And in this city, stories are how we keep score. New York summers come in 2 flavors, humid like a handshake you can't escape, or blazing like a street light with opinions. On the day the city rehearsed for the courtyard, it chose the handshake. Asphalt breathed, brick sweated. People forgave each other for no reason except the forecast. In a borrowed apartment above a hardware store on Wookove, 3 men sat with the windows open and the blinds half closed, which is how you tell the weather you're trying to be discreet. The fan made a heroic sound and produced a decorative breeze. They ignored the heat in the stoic way of men who had learned to be patient with discomfort. They were not the kind of trio that appears on postcards. They were the other kind men, whose names didn't stick to paper, but stuck to results. They spoke softly, saved nouns, and kept verbs in reserve. The first man wore a navy jacket, despite the temperature, because dignity had a dress code. His hair sat on his head like a well-behaved hat. He had the posture of a taxi that knows the route even if you don't. The second man looked like he'd been born leaning against things and learned to stand up later. The third had hands that never forgot a measurement. On the table, a map that had retired from being useful, a legal pad that had ambition, a pen that clicked too much, and a small bottle of graphite powder that caught the light like a joke. "Navy," said the first man, tapping the jacket he was already wearing as if he were auditioning for himself. "Neutral, not memorable, not a story." The second smirked. "In this weather, it's a story." "Not our story," the first said. "Their story." "It was hot, officer. Everyone wore nothing. These wore too much. It sells itself." The third man unscrewed the bottle and tapped a whisper of graphite on the pad, then brushed it with a finger. He examined the sheen like a sommelier. "Door's a talker," he said. "We don't need talkers." "Polite," the first replied. "We make it polite." "Neighbour does?" asked the second, which is another way of asking about witnesses without admitting you care. "They'll see what they've been seeing all year," the first said. "Trucks being trucks, men being men, a hot day being hot. We don't argue with the weather, we make it tell our version." The third lifted a small metal hinge from a paper bag as if he were showing a magician his own deck of cards. "Practice," he said, and turned the hinge. It squeaked, then didn't. He smiled like an engineer who has run out of problems. "No names," the first reminded them, not because they needed reminding, but because rituals have power. "No phones unless you have to. If you have to, don't." Below them, the hardware store bell rang the way bells ring in working neighborhoods. A customer asked for something only hardware people understand. The fan kept pretending. They walked through the route again. Alley, door, kitchen corridor, courtyard. In and out with the grace of punctuation, dash, comma, full stop. The second man timed the journey to the second, because Thai is the only currency that spends itself. The first adjusted the plan by inches. The third counted hinges and decided the city owed him a scholarship. "When?" asked the second. "When the truck blocks the alley," the first said. "Not a minute before, not a minute after." Truck knows what trucks know," the first said. "When and where, not why." The third closed the graphite bottle and put it back in the bag with the kind of care you give to a friend who knows too much. He wiped his fingers on a rag and then wiped the rag on itself, as if privacy could be folded. They ate sandwiches that had ambitions beyond their bread, oil and vinegar making promises, tomatoes trying not to be July. They chewed like professionals. "Nothing to see here. The mouth is on break." "After?" the second asked. He wasn't afraid. He was tidy. "After is simple," the first said. "We leave." "Simple is good," the third said, which is what men say when they know simplicity is the most expensive option. They finished the run-through and cleaned the room of anything that told Thai nor stories. The map became a blank. The pen forgot it had clicked. The legal pad kept one page with a grocery list that had never existed. On the stoop, the heat met them like a dog that doesn't know you're not a dog person. They accepted it. The street accepted them. New York, generous in its indifference, made space. That evening they made their first visit to the alley behind Joe and Mary's. Not a mission, an introduction. The second carried a toolbox whose contents were entirely plausible. The third carried a ladder, which is what men carry when they want to look like they earn a living honestly. The first carried nothing, which is what managers carry. They paused to let the rhythm of the block decide whether it liked them. A neighbour shuffled past with a bag of bottles that would later become better versions of themselves. A cat performed surveillance on the garbage cans with the trained despair of a professional. A delivery truck announced itself and then changed its mind. Evening, the first said to the air, because politeness is a key you can use twice. At the door, the third examined the hinge with the curiosity of a doctor listening to a heart. He opened the bottle and offered the door a small favour. The door accepted. Its squeak became a memory. The first timed the swing with his watch. The second moved the ladder a little to the left and then a little to the right to suggest ongoing maintenance rather than conspiracy. They left without fanfare, polite men leaving a polite alley. The second visit came 2 days later at noon, when the alley had opinions about shade. The toolbox had new respect for gravity. The ladder had a grudge. The third tested the hinge, smooth. He smiled at the hospitality. He adjusted the strike plate by a hair, one of those hairs that matter. A neighbour asked what they were doing. The first man said, making sure the door meets code, and the neighbour, who had memorised a lifetime of codes, decided this code was no concern of his. They checked the kitchen phone line, because lines are cousins. The third's hands produced a neat coil of curiosity cable that would look to a practised eye like a rumour. He ran it along the jack, touched it like an apology, removed it like a secret. He didn't need to hear anything. He just needed to know he could. Timing, the second asked as they stood in the alley, as if the bricks were a clock. 3 minutes, the first said. Door to courtyard, courtyard to door. Not a second left to consider art. The third nodded. Door won't tell on us. Phone won't either. We'd be invited to better parties if we were less courteous. On the third visit, the alley accepted the truck like a guest of honour. It arrived, blocked, apologised with a reverse beep and stayed. The driver looked at his clipboard with the intensity of a man reading the Declaration of Independence. The first man watched the street. The second watched the kitchen corridor through a sliver. The third watched the hinge the way a trainer watches an athlete stretch before a race. Now we trust the weather, the first said, and the calendar and the habit of a man who likes lunch in the sun. They didn't say the name, they knew the name. The room didn't need it. Practice has a way of making the real thing inevitable. They left the alley precisely as they would later leave the courtyard, without drawing attention, without borrowing heroics. The truck unblocked itself. The alley forgot. That is its job. Elsewhere, in a car that had discovered every creak in the suspension and chosen to keep all of them, a lookout traced arcs on a notepad that never learned to be a map. He watched the flow around Joe and Mary's delivery trucks, neighbours with errands, cops who believed in lunch, kids who believed in summer. He watched for patterns and found only New York. This was reassuring. In a second car, a driver practiced patience by not honking more than the law permitted. He and Patience were in a trial separation. He imagined the corridor, the door, the swing, the sunlight on the tablecloth. He imagined the cigar because the papers always did. He did not imagine the ending. He wasn't the imagining type. Up the block, a man with a newspaper he did not read leaned on a hydrant. You could call him a counterbalance. His job, if jobs can be called jobs when they do not produce pay stubs, was to notice and then forget. He was very good at forgetting. The city cooperated. It almost always does. It moved traffic, arranged pauses, assigned decoy arguments to the corner deli, and remembered to schedule a bus for no reason at all. It offered a breeze as a condolence prize. The first man, who managed silence the way other men manage budgets, met with a liaison whose suit had ambitions. They did not discuss favours. They discussed calendars that had been updated. The liaison had a way of smiling that suggested results without confirming them. He gave no guarantees. Guarantees are for electronics. He offered weather. The leader liaison said. Always, the first replied. On the morning itself, the three men woke early, out of respect for tradition. They dressed like clerks. They moved like tourists who didn't want to be asked for directions. They met at a spot that belonged to no one and everyone, a corner where a bus stop had bad grammar and a mailbox had beautiful posture. The second man looked at the sky. Blue, he said. Would have preferred overcast. Sunlight is a witness, the first said, but it's also glare. The third adjusted his cuff, as if a cuff might decide the day. He flexed his fingers the way a pianist does before a recital. He had nothing to play. He knew every note. They walked separately and together, because together is a headline. The city accepted each as single occupants of a minute. In the alley, the truck arrived with the certainty of a punchline. The driver found his clipboard fascinating. The door swung like it had practiced. The kitchen corridor apologized for existing. The courtyard waited. Afterward, our detectives politely edited. Afterward, three men left as planned. The truck concluded its performance, folded its apology, and rolled away. The block exhaled. The sun decided not to remember. In the borrowed apartment, later, the fan kept pretending. The window let in a breeze that had read all the papers. The table was clear. The legal pad had gone to a better life. The graphite bottle was gone and would never be found by anyone with a badge. The second man sat on the sill and stared at the slice of sky he could see between buildings. You ever think about the middle? He asked. The what? The first said, but because he didn't understand, but because questions deserve hydration. The middle of the thing, the second said. Not the why, not the how, the between, where the air changes, where you can still decide not to be the person you became. The third man made a small face that suggested he'd once tried philosophy and found the fit too loose. Middle's just two ends arguing about names, he said. The first considered. He had a talent for silence that made others talk. The middle, he said finally, is where professionals live. They said nothing for a while, because the city had offered them a quiet that felt like an expensive drink. Somewhere a siren started and then forgot why. A child laughed at something that deserved it. A record player on another floor turned nostalgia into furniture. A knock at the door that wasn't a knock. A neighbour letting the hallway know he existed. The three men looked at each other, then at the doorknob, then at their hands. Hands that had measured, timed, held, opened, closed. You ever think about the end? The second asked, because some questions insist. The first smiled, but kindly, not cruelly, just with the efficiency of a man answering a rhetorical. Every day, he said, and then I go to work. They left the apartment as they had entered the day, separately, as if the city had issued them knife slots. The hardware store bell below offered one last opinion. The street applauded with traffic. Meanwhile, our detective's world acquired a new phrase, polite men. It joined his board beside graphite, truck, and umbrella. He drew a line that wasn't a line, more a suggestion of one. He called a contact who collected building keys like baseball cards. He scheduled himself into basements that smelled like decisions. He walked through a garage where the concrete preserved tire prints as fossils. He followed them to a bay with an oil stain shaped like a verdict. He found a clipboard with no sheets and a pen that had signed thoroughly. He stared at an empty hook where a key had once lived and felt the exact weight of nothing. Politeness, he realized, is camouflage. The men who had moved through the alley had used courtesy as a cloak. They had held doors, said excuse day, and reduced suspicion by behaving better than a city expects. It was not irony, it was craft. He wrote in his notebook, "Courtesy is a tool." Then he underlined it, and didn't regret underlining, is it? Back in Bushwick, Joe and Mary's closed early again. The block evolved a ritual around the back door. People glanced at it, and then consciously glanced away, the way you don't look at a scar and then do. Someone taped a small paper icon inside the kitchen, where only staff would see it, a saint rumoured to handle impossible schedules. The owner tested the door and frowned at how well it behaved. He told it, quietly, "You're allowed to squeak," and laughed at himself for talking to a hinge. Down the block, the tailor put a sign in the window, "Alterations within reason." He didn't know why he added "within reason." It felt like the day required a disclaimer. The city cooled, a degree here, a mercy there. Night arrived like a waiter with the check, patient and inevitable. Somewhere, the three men slept. Somewhere else, someone decided to become a candidate for an empty chair. Everywhere, New York practiced its second language, moving on. Our detective stood at his window with a view that wasn't a view brick. A sliver of sky, somebody's laundry proving gravity. He thought about polite men, polite doors, and impolite outcomes. He thought about the space between rehearsal and performance, the slim wedge of time where choice lives. Then he turned off the light and let the city do what it does best, keep the story going. Paper in New York is a migratory species. It flutters from desks to folders to boxes to basements, and when it feels especially brave, to the back seat of a car. It travels in herds labelled invoices, permits, and absolutely not evidence. Paper has a memory longer than grudges and shorter than alibi. The morning after polite men and impolite outcomes, our detective chose to go birdwatching. Not for pigeons, those he could see from his window without leaving the chair, but for the rarer file, the kind stamped received by someone who didn't understand what they were receiving. He started at a city office with lighting designed to make you repent. A clerk named Maria sat behind glass that had survived 3 commissioners and a coffee war. Her nails were immaculate, her patience granite. She knew every form by number and every detective by sigh. "Morning, Maria," he said, sliding a request through the slot like a love letter written by policy. She skimmed it, nodded at 2 commas, and reached for a keyboard that clicked like castanets. Trucking permits, alley access, and a temporary curb occupancy for Knickerbocker between Menahan and Harmon, she read. "You asking for a unicorn with that?" "If you got one in the back," he said. She said, which in Clark means, "I like you enough to pretend the system works. We got a curb occupancy issued last month to a company that doesn't know it's closed yet." He smiled. "Our friends with umbrellas." "Your ghosts," she corrected, and printed a page that smelled like new decisions. "Sign here that you didn't see this." He signed because in this city you sometimes initial the truth to make it legal. From there he visited a union hall where coffee kept getting refilled out of respect for tradition. Men who knew more than they said sat at tables pretending to choose retirement plans. A board announced shifts and a bake sale, because even complicated lives need brownies. He asked about the truck. Eyes drifted, shoulders shrugged like modest saints. "We outsource sometimes," said a man whose hands had argued with cargo for decades. "Temporary contractor, you know how temporary we're there." I.e., the detective said, temporary makes permanent look lazy. The man smiled a little and slid over a list that wasn't a list, more a suggestion of one. It had 5 names. 4 were ordinary. 1 was the sticky note from yesterday wearing a different hat. At the registry, a woman with a pencil behind her ear explained that some businesses open and close like umbrellas in a passing shower. They get wet, they get dry, they move on, she said, stamping something with the rhythm of a drummer who refuses to learn new songs. He collected ghost companies like baseball cards, Delaware incorporations with apartments for offices, P.O. boxes with more square footage than their owners, directors who had inconveniently passed away before they were born. Each paper led to another paper. Each signature belonged to an alias good at penmanship. At noon, he and his partner regrouped at a coffee shop that served espresso by the ounce and opinions by the pound. The board behind the counter advertised a macchiato with oat milk, which neither of them understood but respected for trying. Paper says the alley was reserved, the detective said. Paper says a lot of things, the partner replied. Like I'm 5'9". Curb permits clean, the detective went on. Issued 3 weeks before. Duration 7 days. Purpose. Routine maintenance. Company. Our umbrella's imaginary cousin. The partner stirred his coffee like it had secrets. Somebody did the paperwork. That's almost considerate. Courtesy as a tool, the detective said, and the partner rolled his eyes in a way that meant he agreed. They divided the stack. The partner took incorporation records and a stubborn donut. The detective took delivery manifests and a stubborn headache. The manifests led to a warehouse on the edge of Williamsburg, whose brick had gone to art school. We're interested in a truck that likes alleys, the detective said. Aren't we all, the foreman replied. Ghost company, the detective continued. Borrowed a curb for a week. Do you rent out place? We rent time, the foreman said. Everything else is union. Time is a plate, the detective said. They looked at each other like men examining a mirror. The foreman exhaled a small laugh, then very slightly shrugged toward a bay at the back. Guy with a clipboard used a desk there for 2 mornings, filled out checks in ink, had a neat wrist. Said he represented a subcontractor who preferred sunlight. Knee wrist. Knee wrist, the foreman said. You can tell by how they sign. Straight line, no hesitation. Men who hesitate wreck pallets. The detective walked to the bay. The desk was clean now, kind of clean that comes from erasure, not from pride. On the wall above it, a corkboard had 1 staple left behind like a witness who missed the bus. He pried it out and pocketed it, on the theory that everything is evidence if you hold it long enough. Back at the precinct, he tried the staple on a whim, because whims occasionally pay rent. It matched staples used by a certain brand of office supply currently sold in. He checked 3 stores within 5 blocks of Joe and Mary's. He felt both clever and ridiculous. The city accepted both emotions at the same time, as it often does. He visited the nearest store and bought a box of the same staples, just to thorough, and because he needed staples. The cashier rang him up with the gravity of a priest, then asked if he wanted a receipt for his accounting. Always, he said. Paper respects paper. On the way out, he almost bumped into a woman whose tote bag advertised a newspaper. She apologized, and he recognized her by her apology. The reporter from the courtyard, the one whose microphone had tape declaring a station nobody remembered. You again, she said, smiling like a person who collects recurring characters. Me again, he said. You writing the book already? I'm writing the chapter headings, she said. The sources are still deciding if they want to be named after breakfast. He considered, then asked, What do you know about umbrellas? I know they flip in thunderstorms, she said, and some of them have initials painted on the handle. Who owns the pint? She tilted her head. depend on who you ask under it. They were speaking in parables, which was a sign the city had become interesting again. He offered her nothing, and she offered him less. They exchanged cards anyway, the ritual of people who might need to pretend later that they met by accident. He returned to the board and moved things around in ways only he understood. Hinge near permit, truck plate near ghost company, reporter's card pinned to the corner like a weather forecast. The board still refused to tell a linear story, but it had begun to hum. Late afternoon delivered a tip shaped like a rumour. There'd been a meet in the back room of a social club off Lorimer. Cigar smoke, low voices, a calendar on the wall turned to the wrong month. The source described a map on a table with a coffee ring over Bushwick. He went. The club wore the hard-earned glamour of failed renovations. Men played cards with faces that had seen the same hand for 20 years. He asked for the back room. Faces performed forgetfulness. A bartender discovered an urgent need to inventory lime. Out back, he found a room with no one in it, and a table that still smelled like opinions. On the wall, a framed photograph of a softball team with the year smudged. On a shelf, a small tin of graphite labelled in neat letters, "Door." He stared at the tin. It stared back. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He took a photo and wrote the bar's name on a napkin with a pen that leaked a little. "Looking for something?" asked a voice behind him. The bartender. "Jerchins," the detective said. "We only give those to people leaving," the bartender replied, not unkindly. He left, not because he was finished, but because doors, polite or not, have manners you have to respect. Evening, a call from his partner. "Your umbrella has a cabana," the partner said. "Shell under a shell. The money paths cross in Queens, then upstate, then take a weekend in Jersey. Any names that don't dissolve in water." "One," the partner said, and gave it a mid-level fixer whose resume included union introductions, event permits, and a talent for being between things. The kind of man who lent you a ladder and somehow owned your roof. The detective had met him once at a fundraiser for a cause nobody could define. A handshake like a velvet glove, a smile like scissors. He wrote the name on the pad, circled it, and didn't regret the circle. They found the fixer at a steakhouse where the booths had privacy settings. He was in conversation with a man who worked in asphalt and knew more about streets than anyone elected to manage them. The fixer saw the detective, and the smile arrived first. "Detective," he said, as if they had just been discussing him. "Is the city behaving?" "It's very polite," the detective said. The fixer laughed in a key that said, "I understand the reference, and also your mortgage. How can I help the public today?" "Umbrellas," the detective said, "and curb permits for friends who don't sign their names." The fixer raised his hands in a pantomime of innocence. "We provide introductions," he said. "Nothing more dangerous than names. If names scare you, I offer numbers." "Numbers pay for doors," the detective said. "Numbers pay for everything," the fixer said, and then glanced at the asphalt man, who checked his watch and discovered an exit. "Tell me about a truck that needed Knickerbocker to hold its breath," the detective said. "I can tell you the city takes logistics seriously," the fixer said, "and that sometimes a favour greases a hinge." He sipped water, that wine, and sometimes the hinge already wanted to open. "This hinge had graphite," the detective said. "Then it was a conscientious hinge," the fixer said, amused by his own line. He leaned in. "Detective, if I had $1 for every time someone asked me to remember a truck, I'd own something worth driving." "You remember people," the detective said. "I remember invoices," the fixer said, "but they go to companies with complicated feelings about birthdays." "Help me remember a name," the detective said, and slid across the sticky note from the day before. The fixer studied it like a menu. "I've seen the handwriting," he said at last. "Neem wrist." The foreman said the same. The detective said. "Common wrists," the fixer said, returning the note. "You should meet the uncommon ones." He stood, a signal that the conversation had completed its lap. "Detective, the city is a great collaborator. It will give you everything you need except the last inch." "That's where everyone lies," the fixer said, and glided away. Night pressed in with the gentle insistence of a long-pending decision. The detective walked, because walking is how you think when sitting has failed. He cut across blocks that smelled like bakery and exhaust, past a church locking its gate with the tenderness of a parent, and arrived at the precinct with shoes that had learned too much. On the board, the story had grown. Paper permits, ghost companies, a foreman's shrug, a graphite tin in a back room, a fixer with neat wrists. He pinned the steakhouse matchbook to the corner and felt slightly silly. He didn't mind. Investigations are part geometry, part superstition. A message waited on his desk from the reporter. 3 words. "Umbrella has handle." A phone number followed. He called. She answered on the first ring, because curiosity cannot stand silence. "Your ghost company has a real landlord," she said. "The check comes from a charity that likes parades and hates audits. Guess who sits on the board?" She gave him a name that belonged to a man with a low profile and high leverage. Not famous, more permanent than famous. "Can you print that?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But you can visit the charity and ask about their commitment to civic engagement." He thanked her and reached for his coat. He didn't put it on. He sat and looked at the board again, at how the lines were starting to act like lines. He allowed himself a small, private hope that paper would do what paper sometimes does, confess without realizing it. Before leaving, he called Joe and Mary's to check on the owner, because courtesy is also a tool. The owner answered with a voice that had adjusted to a new weight. "Door still polite?" the detective asked. "It squeaked once," the owner said. "I felt better." He smiled into the phone, promised to stop by, and hung F. On the way out, he passed a corkboard where notices come to live forever. Retirement parties, softball schedules, a flyer for a missing parrot named Tony who had been missing since 3 commissioners ago. He pinned nothing, because he had everything he needed for the next day. A charity to visit, a landlord to interrogate, a fixer to politely annoy. The city outside had cooled into something almost forgiving. A breeze carried the smell of August decisions and bakery ambition. A couple argued quietly about nothing important and then laughed at themselves. A bus arrived late and was thanked anyway. In an apartment above a hardware store that had become a footnote, the 3 men slept like dignified ghosts, separately, without dreaming, because dreams are a luxury. In another part of town, the fixer dry-cleaned his neat wrist and set his alarm for the hour when deals are most honest. And in Bushwick, the back door at Joe and Mary's remembered, very slightly, how to complain. It offered a small shy squeak into the night. The neighborhood heard it and slept better. New York has a talent for pretending to be fine. It will fix its hair in a storefront reflection and tell you it slept great. It will serve breakfast on time and quietly change the locks. After the courtyard, the city decided to be fine with extra enthusiasm. Schedules were kept, papers were delivered, dogs performed their civic duty on hydrants. But if you stood still long enough, you could feel it block long inhale that hadn't been exhaled yet. Joe and Mary's opened on time. The sign in the window declared lunch, as if the word itself could mend things. Regulars reappeared one by one with the awkward courage of people visiting a friend after surgery. The back corner table remained empty by common law. The server moved with careful humour, offering extra bread like an apology from the universe. Our detective stopped by first thing, not to interrogate but to calibrate. He wore the expression city workers develop when they're trying to encourage gravity to be gentle. The owner waved him in with a nod that had learned 2 new languages since last week. "How's the door?" the detective asked, because in this story that is basically a wellness check. "It squeaks again," the owner said. People clap. The detective smiled. That's community theatre. He sat at the counter with coffee that remembered his preferences. The radio murmured weather and a baseball score that sounded like a moral. Someone ordered eggplant, the way a man orders a truce. The kitchen breathed out steam like a dragon on a union break. A pair of uniforms came in, not the kind that give tickets, the kind that receive confessions from benches. They ordered sandwiches with the solemnity of treaties, and sat where they could watch the door without being obvious about it. The server refilled waters with a gentleness usually reserved for new parents and explosives. The detective didn't take notes. He took in the temperature. The block's heartbeat had slowed. It wasn't back to resting, but it had decided to live. On his way out, he passed a small cluster of neighbours performing the ritual known as "we're not talking about it while we talk about it." A woman in a denim jacket said, "You hear they say he was," and her friend cut her off with a look that translated to use the polite word. "Unalive," the friend said. "Right," the woman nodded. "Unalive." Language, too, had adjusted. He headed to the charity the reporter had mentioned, the one with a mission statement so vague it could cover weather, literacy, and the moon. The office lived in a brownstone whose stoop had opinions about shoes. Inside, a receptionist in a cardigan of ironclad pleasantness asked if he had an appointment. "Are you now?" he said, and showed a badge without introducing it. The director arrived with a smile polished by fundraising. He knew the detective from television in the same way everyone knows everyone from television. Inaccurately, but with conviction. "How can we be of service?" he asked, which is a sentence that should always be weighed on a scale. "I'm chasing paper," the detective said. "One of your checks pays rent for a community program with very efficient trucks." The director's smile remained obedient. "We support many initiatives that enhance quality of life." "Does quality of life include curb occupancy permits?" "Sometimes," the director said, considering his next word carefully enough to invoice it. "We help with logistics for neighborhood events, parades, street fairs." "And alley maintenance?" "Neighborhoods have alleys," the director said, which wasn't an answer but was at least true. "We outsource to contractors who comply with all regulations and also with whichever regulations apply." "Who chooses the contractors?" "A committee," he said promptly, which is what people say when one person decides. "Who's on the committee?" "Civic partners," he said, and produced a list whose ink was still drying. The names were exactly the sort of names you put on lists like this. Respectable, vaguely familiar, capable of throwing a dinner. One name belonged to our fixer with the neat wrist. It had a title, Community Liaison. "And this one?" the detective asked, tapping it with the pen that had leaked on the bar napkin last night. "He's a bridge," the director said, "between needs and solutions." Bridges charge tolls, the detective said, and pocketed a brochure about improving neighborhoods through collaboration. Outside, the city had leaned into sunshine. People forgave taxis. Pigeons rehearsed. A child dragged a helium balloon that tried to defect skyward. The detective stood on the stoop long enough to recognize the car that wasn't parked across the street yesterday. It was parked there today. It had patience in the glove compartment. He walked to the curb and looked in the reflection of a window. 2 men in the car studied nothing with fierce attention. He nodded the professional nod that means, We can see each other. We will pretend we can't." They nodded back. New York is a very polite town when it wants to do. At the precinct, his partner had news and a sandwich that had given. "Routers vote now?" "In this city, everything votes," the partner said. "Even chairs." They split a to-do list with the bland confidence of men who had broken to-do lists before. The detective went to find Mr. Asphalt. The partner went to make friends with a clerk who guarded the permit office like a dragon that had read Proust. Mr. Asphalt met him on a job site that smelled like summer and contracts. They stood near a pothole that had joined the union and received benefits. Mr. Asphalt had a face that looked carved from the road itself. He referred to himself in the third person if it helps negotiation. "We fill holes," Mr. Asphalt said, gesturing at the city like a floor plan. "You cops make them. We fix them. Everybody eats." "Speaking of eating," the detective said, "you had lunch with a man who sells introductions." "Many men sell many things," Mr. Asphalt said. "Some sell lunch and call it introductions." "The Charities Committee to Enhance Quality of Life," the detective said. "Our friend with the neat wrist sits on it." Mr. Asphalt took off his hard hat and let the sun reconsider him. "Quality of life is a good phrase," he said. "You can invoice it." "You pay for curb space through the charity," the detective said. "The charity pays the city. Everyone sleeps well." "Curb space is democracy," Mr. Asphalt said. "People should share." "When does sharing become choreography?" Mr. Asphalt put the hard hat back on. "When the music starts." "Whose band?" "The city's," he said, which is a polite way to say the band changes, the song doesn't. The detective left with a card and a headache and a renewed respect for metaphors that wear steel-toed boots. He called his partner. "Our fixer's fingerprints aren't on anything," he said, "which is how you know it's him." "Clerk says the curb permit request came through a city council office," the partner said. "Routine, stamped, filed, blessed. If you're going to move the furniture, get a moving permit." "Which office?" "Seat currently occupied by a man who loves ribbon cuttings," the partner said. "His scheduler knows the charity director's assistant's sister. Nothing illegal, just familial." "Cousins," the detective said. "Always cousins," the partner agreed. Afternoon drifted toward a more serious version of itself. The detective returned to Joe and Mary's because sometimes the point of investigation is remembering what isn't paper. The server brought him coffee without asking. He thanked her with a tip that said, "You're doing a hard job and I noticed." A woman at the counter told a story about her uncle's radiator that was absolutely not a story about anything else. A man at a table near the window argued with the newspaper on behalf of the Mets. 2 teenagers came in and asked if there was a special for students and got one, because kindness is cheaper than advertising. He took a slow walk to the courtyard and stood near the empty back corner table. He looked up at the cutout of sky that had witnessed too much and not enough. He listened to the honest squeak of the door as someone from the kitchen pushed through with a tray of glasses. The sound small and human and, there was no other word, alive. Back out front, a man he had never seen before took the stool next to him and ordered coffee. The man had the careful haircut of a broker and the watch of a man who doesn't check it because everyone else will. He nodded at the detective's badge without comment. "You from the building?" the man asked. "I'm from the arguments," the detective said. The man smiled politely. "I handle accounts," he said. "For charities, for clubs, for kitchens that want to stay kitchens." "Knee wrist?" the detective asked mildly. The man looked at his own hand like it had told a joke without him. "Some of us were taught penmanship," he said. "It's a lost art." "Does your art include umbrellas?" "Sometimes," the man said, "on rainy days." He sipped coffee like a verdict. "Detective, the city already decided. Your work is admirable. It will not be rewarded." "Not by you," the detective said. "Not by outcome," the man said. "Outcome has appointments." He placed money under the saucer and left with the air of someone who had just signed for a package addressed to fate. The detective didn't follow. There is a time for following and a time for memorizing a gate. He chose the latter. He called his partner. "Nearest just introduced himself," he said. "He's proud of his penmanship." "No way we even bid to hear l'affaire." "Didn't see it," the detective said. "But I know the sound of his shoes. They don't squeak." Evening found him at his desk with the board that had grown crowded. He started moving things again, not because they needed moving, but because sometimes the mind requires a gesture to believe in progress. He drew a line from charity to council office to permit to truck to door to courtyard. Then, in a small act of optimism, he added, "Morning after," and drew the line back to Joe and Mary's. He took a breath. The city took one with him. A junior detective poked his head in. "Boss, reporters here," he said, like announcing a storm that could either water your garden or cancel the game. She stepped in with the tote bag again, and a smile that had filed for press credentials. "I have something you don't," she said. "I have coffee that might argue," he said. "A schedule," she said, dropping a photocopy that had survived a fax machine. "Your neat wrist had a standing appointment every Thursday morning at a social club off Lorimer. On the calendar, it's coded as choir practice." "Tin of graphite in the back room," he said. She blinked, pleased they were reading the same book. "Also," she continued, "a check cut from the charity to a vendor labeled Door Services. The vendor's address is a P.O. box inside a bodega where the cat decides who gets mail." "The cat votes too," he said. She lowered her voice. "You can't say any of this on the record yet, but if you push the charity through the council office, you'll find a staffer who loves talk radio and hates subpoenas. He'll give you the rest because he believes in civic hygiene." "Hygiene is underrated," he said. She looked at his board, at the stringless string of it, and nodded with professional respect. "You'll never get the upstairs names," she said, "but you'll get the middle ones. Sometimes that's enough to change the downstairs." "Downstairs is where the door lives," he said. They walked out together. The city had cooled. The streetlights auditioned halo effects. Somewhere, a saxophone forgave a trumpet. They parted at the corner with the unspoken agreement of colleagues who are our colleagues, but are definitely on the same street. On his way home, the detective passed a church where a janitor was locking up. The janitor recognized him as a recurring character. "You catch the men?" the janitor asked. "I'm catching the weather," the detective said. "Harder," the janitor said, amused. "Weather always wins." "Not always," the detective said. "Sometimes it apologizes." He slept lightly, woke early, and put on a suit that had been to more hearings than weddings. The plan for the next day was simple. Visit the council office, talk to the staffer with convictions about hygiene, subpoena the charity's vendor list, invite the fixer to a conversation in a room with temperature control, and remind the world that doors are supposed to be too polite. Before sunrise, he stopped at Joe and Mary's for coffee to go. The owner was already there, straightening sugar packets with a reverence that suggested prayer. "You going to make it right?" the owner asked, not angrily, not even hopeful, just practical. "I'm going to make it honest," the detective said. "Honest is a start," the owner said. "Honest gets you to lunch." Outside, the city finally exhaled. You could hear it in the way the buses sighed, in the way a bakery door opened, in the way the back door at Joe and Mary's offered its small squeak to the morning, as if to say, "Still here." The street had held its breath long enough. Now it wanted to talk. Social clubs in New York are where history goes to play cards. The banquettes remember more names than the plaques. The wallpaper is a witness. And somewhere in back there's always a room for events that are neither social nor club. On the calendar, these events have euphemisms: maintenance review, community outreach, choir practice. Choirs, famously, do meet in rooms with no piano. The club off Lorimer had the proper credentials: a neon sign that still believed, a door that did not, and a bartender who could fold a napkin into a subpoena. In the back, the room smelled faintly of graphite and louder of cigars that had made promises to better days. On the shelf, a tin that said door in neat handwriting, as if etiquette could be tinned. Our detective arrived in daylight, which is considered rude by places that prefer their sunlight second-hand. He flashed his badge, which is an all-access pass to awkward silences. The bartender considered whether the day required cooperation, and decided it did, but only in lowercase. "Backrooms for members," the bartender said. "I'm a member of the city," the detective said. "That's a large club," the bartender said, and unlocked the door anyway. Inside folding chairs with opinions, a long table that had negotiated more ceasefires than anyone in government, and a bulletin board featuring a bowling team from 1970 pictured with trophies and hair. On the table sat a clean ledger book, too clean, like a conscience used for company. Next to it, a brass bell, kind you ring when you want quiet to applaud. He sat, because sitting changes the angle of a room's memory. He flipped the ledger. It was immaculate and also unhelpful. Columns of dues, notes about holiday raffles, nothing with verbs. Choir practice appeared every Thursday, written in a wrist with discipline issues. He pressed his finger against indentations left on a blank page. Someone had written on the page above, hard enough to leave ghosts. He angled the book toward the light and rubbed the surface with the flat of a pencil. Words rose like guilty secrets: truck, curb, noon, alley, and 3 first names too common to be useful, unless you already knew them. The bartender knocked on the doorframe with the etiquette of a man telling you the tide is coming in. "You'll want to talk to Sal," he said. "He keeps the keys and the stories." Sal arrived with a ring of keys that weighed like a hobby and a face that said he had no hobbies. He nodded at the detective as if they'd agreed to disagree in a previous lifetime. "We're a club," Sal said. "We play cards, we raise money for widows, we yell at televisions. That's the mission statement." "And choir practice?" the detective asked. Sal shrugged with great professionalism. "A joke," he said. "We don't sing. Some fellas meet, talk about the bowling schedule. It's not a felony to organize pins." "Pins don't need graphite," the detective said. "Doors do." Sal looked at the shelf, like a man realizing his furniture had started leaving clues. "People borrow," he said. "We're neighborly." "Neverly is a good word," the detective said. "It covers sins and casseroles." Sal's keys jingled in a minor key. "Detective, we pay our taxes. We hold raffles. We sponsor a little league team that never wins. If men use this room to talk about maintenance, how is that?" "Maintenance for whose door?" The detective cut in gently. "Because I have a door in Bushwick that suddenly found religion." Sal sighed, the kind of sigh that has a mailing address. "We rent the room," he said. "Cash. In an envelope." They signed the book. "The book with blank pages," the detective said. Sal spread his hands. "Cleanliness is next to godliness." "Godliness never met subpoenas," the detective said. He left with photocopies of nothing and a photograph in his phone of everything. Outside, the reporter was waiting with the patience of a cat who knows the kitchen schedule. "Choir practice?" she asked. 3 tenors and a baritone, he said. "I have your baritone," she said, passing him a clipping, a charity gala photo. There he was, Fixer with the neat wrist, standing between a councilman and a priest, all three men smiling at a check the size of a coffee table. The caption credited the charity for improving quality of life. "Do you ever get tired of that phrase?" he asked. "I get tired of phrases," she said. "People are less predictable." They walked the block. She caught him. The staffer at the council office had indeed practiced civic hygiene. He provided emails that said nothing and implied a chorus. The charity had requested facilitated permits for community maintenance on specific alleys, including the one behind Joe and Mary's, over a 7-day window. A city liaison had approved with a rubber stamp so enthusiastic it probably needed ice afterward. "And the payment?" he asked. "Vendor called Door Services," she said. "Paid through a P.O. box with a cat. Our cat refuses to comment." He allowed himself the smallest smile. "Respect the cat." "Always," she said. "Also, your neat wrist filed a reimbursement form for the graphite tin, itemized as lubricant for community access. Honest to a fault." "Honest and polite," he said. "Our theme." He sent the new information to his partner, who replied with a thumbs up that somehow conveyed exhaustion. Then he made a choice that would either be productive or at least entertaining. He invited the fixer for coffee. The fixer chose a hotel lounge where the lighting made everyone eligible for indulgence. He arrived on tie, which in his line of work is also a flex. He wore a suit that didn't know how to wrinkle and a tie that wouldn't dare. "Detective," he said, "you look like a man who wants to choreograph traffic." "I'm more interested in who hired the band," the detective said. "Bands are self-organizing," the fixer said, amused. "So are cities, with the right sheet music." "Who provided the sheet music for the alley?" "The neighborhood," he said, spreading his hands. "Everyone wants the alley to behave. We merely introduced lubricant to a tense situation." "Graphic? Civic kindness," he said. "Doors should open when residents need them." "And when polite men need them?" He raised an eyebrow. "Polite men are residents," he said, "of fine, if nothing else." "Who paid the track?" "A contractor," he said. "All legal, all documented, all filed. If you enjoyed paperwork, this is a thrilling romance." "The charity covered it," the detective said. "The charity improves quality of life," he said. "Have you seen that alley? It's a menace to strollers." "Strollers don't schedule themselves for noon," the detective said. He smiled. "Detective, the city prefers narratives it can file. You're writing an epic. They accept pamphlets." "Try me," the detective said. The fixer leaned in just enough to suggest intimacy without risking trust. "Let's say a neighborhood has a problem. The problem is loud. The neighbors want quiet. People with umbrellas think about rain. Someone calls for choir practice. You can't arrest a metaphor." "You can if it invoices," the detective said. He laughed softly. "Then you'll arrest all of us," he said, "because in New York, everyone invoices the weather." "Tell me why," the detective said, keeping his voice even, not the choreography. "The reason the music started." "The city needed a reset," the fixer said. "You can't run a block with a trumpet section that refuses to modulate. People want to walk their kids without a headline." He sat back. This was a civic correction. "A man was made unalive," the detective said. "And the city continued," the fixer said. "As it must, as it always will. Detective, you chase names because the law respects nouns. I manage verbs. Tomorrow has to function." The detective considered the temptation to stand up and announce handcuffs. He allowed it to pass like a bus that says out of service but stops anyway. "We're not done talking," he said. "We never are," the fixer said, and left a tip so generous it felt like an argument. Outside, the sidewalk tried on evening. He called his partner. "He thinks he's the city's conscience," the detective said. "Most consciences don't bill by the hour," the partner said. "Our council staffer is ready to sing if subpoenaed. He has a folder labelled Stuff I Don't Want to Testify About, which he thinks makes it private." "Get the folder," the detective said. They reconvened at the precinct, with coffee and the energy of men pushing a heavy object uphill, because gravity was being smug. The folder contained exactly what the label promised. Emails with subject lines like RE, maintenance, notes from community partners, a spreadsheet of curb permits cross-listed with events, and a memo about the unfortunate courtyard incident using all the correct euphemisms. At the bottom, a list of liaisons with initials instead of names. One set of initials matched the fixer's. Another set matched someone higher up who preferred public ribbon cuttings to private consequences. "Enough for a hearing," the partner said. "Not enough for bracelets." "Sometimes hearings are bracelets," the detective said. They drafted requests and courtesies disguised as demands. They CC'd people who made phones ring. They scheduled a visit with the charity's board council, who would smile through fire. They wrote a letter to the club off Lorimer asking for membership rosters dating back to bowling trophies. They did the part of the job that looks least like television and most like office work, with better lighting. The reporter texted, "Choir practice, moving to a different room." She added a winking emoji, which is a modern way of saying, "Hurry up." The next morning they arrived at the club just as a meet broke like a wave. Men left in pairs, 3 at a time, singly and in thoughtful silence. The fixer was not among them. Sal watched from behind the bar, polishing a glass that had been polished into transparency. The detective stepped into the back room and found the ledger gone, the bell replaced by a pitcher of water, and the graphite tin moved 2 inches to the left. The bulletin board now displayed a signed note for a picnic. He smiled. The room thought it had redecorated. It had, in fact, confessed. "Looking for hymns?" the bartender asked. "Just checking the acoustics," the detective said. On his way out, he ran into a priest, one from the gala photo, carrying 2 trays of ziti-like benedictions. The priest recognized him from the neighborhood and thanked him for keeping the peace, which is what you say when you're avoiding saying other things. "Father," the detective said. "Do choirs ever practice without singing?" Constantly, the priest said. "It's called meeting." He smiled in a way that admitted knowledge of calendars if fit names. "Detective, I pray for outcomes. You work on inputs." "God sees the receipts," the priest said, and kept walking. Afternoon brought subpoenas with the gentle clatter of doom. The council office discovered a sudden passion for transparency. The charity's council recommended cooperation in a memo that used the word "fulsome" twice and meant neither. The club considered whether the picnic should be potato salad or macaroni and opted for both, because division is unwise in a city this small. In Bushwick, the door at Joe and Mary's continued its honest squeak. People began to eat in the courtyard again, some choosing the back corner on purpose, as if to argue with the universe. The owner moved through the room like a man carrying both history and water. Our detective sat for a late lunch, alone, with the comfort of being a regular at a place that had survived a headline. The server brought him the good bread and a look that said, "We are still here." He lifted his glass in a small toast to the room. The room lifted itself back. A man slid onto the stool beside him. Not the fixer, a new face, younger. He wore a jacket he didn't deserve and a watch that had lied about its price. He ordered coffee and stared at the detective with the curiosity of a recruit. "You the guy," the man said. Possibly, the detective said. They said you were stubborn, the man said. Said you'd keep knocking until the door learned a new sound. I'm teaching vocabulary, the detective said. The man leaned in. They're moving choir practice, he said softly. Different room, different club, same hymn. Why tell me? The man shrugged like a man testing out integrity for size. Because my cousin says the city belongs to whoever cares the most, and today it looks like you. He scribbled an address on the back of a matchbook and left enough cash to insult the concept of coffee. Then he left without looking back, which is either bravery or training. The detective flipped the matchbook. The address belonged to a social hall near the water, bigger rooms, better soundproofing, nicer chairs. He called his partner. Field trip, he said. They arrived to find doors that had mastered neutrality and a manager who had the soul of a ledger. Private event, the manager said, pronouncing the phrase as if it paid taxes. We love private events, the detective said. They're great for the public. The manager considered the mathematics of that and led them to a hallway where you could hear nothing and somehow hear everything. Laughter, glass, a bell not unlike the one that had rung for quiet at the other club. He knocked and then opened without waiting. The room froze, as rooms do when they realize they're about to be named. At the head of the table sat the fixer, neat wrist mid-gesture. He smiled the smile he kept for cameras, then let it drop for efficiency. Around him sat men who didn't consider themselves an audience. On the table, maps, calendars, a tin of graphite labelled Community Access, and a printed email that read subject, Maintenance. Afternoon choir, the detective said. We were just discussing outreach, the fixer said, not missing a step. Can we help you reaching out? Yes, the detective said. Hand me that tin. A silence followed, brief and educational. The fixer kept his eye contact steady, then reached for the tin and slid it across with a courtesy that would photograph well. The detective held it at. The room inhaled. Gentlemen, the detective said, this is me singing. He pocketed the tin in a gesture equal parts theatre and warning. You're all receiving subpoenas, he added. Consider them invitations. The city would love to hear your choir. The fixer's smile returned, slightly smaller. We believe in civic participation, he said. Then bring sheet music, the detective said, and left before the room could decide whether to applaud or make calls. On the sidewalk, his partner let out the laugh he'd been holding. Bellissimo, he said, which in cop means nice move. We'll pay for it later. They'll lawyer up, the partner added. Great, the detective said. Lawyers sing on the record. They walked to the car past a river that had seen more commerce than confessions. The city looked exactly the same as it always does when something irreversible has just happened. A ferry honked. A jogger negotiated with humidity. Back in Bushwick, Joe and Mary's served dinner to a room that had decided to be brave about it. The owner propped the back door open for an hour, letting in air and the faint sound of a neighbourhood continuing. The squeak worked like punctuation. The reporter called. You really walked out with the tin? She asked, delighted. I'm building a percussion section, he said. Save me a front row seat, she said. I think the city's ready for a concert. He hung up and looked at his board, now heavier with nouns and braver with lines. Charity to council, to permits to trucks, to doors, to rooms called choir practice. Politeness as camouflage, courtesy as leverage, quality of life as a budget line. He wrote one more phrase at the top, the middle sings. Then he underlined it, hard. Night came on like a curtain that knows its cues. Somewhere, the three polite men practiced being shadows again, because that is what shadows do. Somewhere else, upstairs, people measured chairs and futures. Down here, on the ground floor where doors squeak and restaurants heal, the detective finished his coffee and decided to sleep before the concert. Because tomorrow, the choir would have to perform where the microphones are, and for once the city might prefer lyrics to humming. The phrase quality of life does a lot of heavy lifting. It can justify planting trees and removing benches. It can explain noise ordinances and fireworks, community gardens and strategic forgetfulness. It's a phrase with a day job and a night life. In the week after the courtyard, it showed up everywhere. On memum, on podiums, on lips that preferred adjectives to nouns. Our detective started his morning with it printed across a banner in the lobby of a municipal building designed to intimidate pigeons. A press conference was forming, the way weather forms. Microphones gathered, cameras rehearsed focus, and staffers adjusted the world by moving water bottles half an inch at a time. The councilman, with the ribbon-cutting habit, stepped up to the podium and smiled like the city had just passed a quiz. "We are committed to the quality of life of every neighborhood," he said, emphasizing every the way a man emphasizes a word he's rented. "To that end, we are streamlining permits for community maintenance and safety." The detective watched from the back with the calm of a man who had seen streamlining used as both solution and solvent. He recognized two staffers, one of whom believed in civic hygiene, the other believed in calendars. Both believed in the phrase, "on the banner," because their paychecks did. Reporters asked questions, good and bad. The councilman answered with words that had all been introduced to each other at the rehearsal. He didn't say umbrella, he didn't say alley, he said together 4 times. The city nodded. Together is comforting, even when it's a crowd scene with no credits. After the cameras packed up, the detective found the hygienic staffer in a hallway with earnest lighting. "You brought the folder," he said. "I brought a copy of the folder," the staffer corrected, holding it like a choir book. "I also brought a lawyer's card, because I'm not brave, I'm tidy." "Tidy is brave in this town," the detective said, and took the copy. It contained the emails he'd already seen, plus an attachment titled Maintenance Alignment Framework, which is what you name a plan when it doesn't want to be guilty of plotting. He skimmed. The framework suggested partnering with community liaisons to identify infrastructural stress points in alleys and courtyards, and coordinating temporary curb occupancy for equipment staging. It listed a liaison table with initials, his fixer among them, and a note. All communications verbal, unless otherwise required. "Verbal is a beautiful word," he said. "It's the city's favorite," the staffer said. No typos. He thanked the staffer and walked out into a blue morning performing optimism. On the steps, the reporter waited with coffee and a grin earned by long nights. "You're trending," she said. "Quietin is a hit." "I'll sell tickets," he said. She matched his stride. "I'm hearing the Charities Council is preparing a statement about cooperation and values. It will use the word fulsome incorrectly again." "Maybe they'll misspell it," he said. "Hope is a strategy," she said, deadpan. They parted with the efficiency of people who had learned to narrate without narrating. He headed to the charity's office for the meeting their council had agreed to, in a tone suggesting they preferred phone calls to consequences. The board counsel wore a suit that had argued with worse facts and won. He offered water as if hydration might mitigate subpoenas. "Detective," he said, "we support any and all inquiries that aim to improve the quality of life." "There it is again," the detective said. "We have nothing to hide," counsel continued. "We believe in transparency." He gestured at a stack of folders tied with ribbon. "Here are our recent vendor lists and contracts. Door service." An independent contractor counsel said, vetted, insured, and according to their invoices, very fond of lubrication. "Graphite is a crowd pleaser," the detective said. Counsel's smile did nothing. You understand, Detective. Our donors expect us to act quickly when communities request assistance. If a liaison identifies a hazard, we facilitate solutions. Your liaison facilitated a truck to block an alley at noon, the detective said. Counsel lifted a brow. We facilitate many trucks, he said. Trucks are the city's bloodstream. Who approves the schedules? A committee, Counsel said, refusing to smirk. He paged the vendor list. Door services appeared 18 times in 3 months. The P.O. box address remained loyal to the cat. Each invoice described access improvements and community ingress management. The dates formed a map if you knew how to squint. Do you also facilitate umbrellas? The detective asked. We facilitate outcomes, Counsel said, and then, because he was a professional, added, lawful outcomes. Define lawful, the detective said. Define door, Counsel replied, pleasantly. He left with copies and a promise of ongoing partnership. Outside, the clouds considered their options. The city as weather, the way people have moods. Today's mood was collaborative, with a chance of denial. Back at the precinct, his partner had acquired a wall calendar from the social hall by the water, for events planning, the manager had said, forgetting the definition of events. The calendar featured highlighted Thursdays labelled with a tasteful choir icon. We're going to need a bigger corkboard, the partner said. They mapped dates to permits, to truck rentals, to access improvements. The lines began to make a shape. Not the kind you could show a jury yet, but a shape the city would recognise if it looked in a mirror. You've got the middlemen, the partner said. We're still missing the upstairs, the ones who invented Folsom. Upstairs has rugs, the detective said. We'll pull the corners. They sent a formal notice to the councilman's office requesting testimony from the Community Liaison Committee. They CC council. They CC a newspaper, because accidents happen. Then the phone rang. It was the fixer. Detective, he said. Your paperwork is very energetic. It's a cardio routine, the detective said. Let's avoid theatrics, the fixer said. We both live here. Then you know the doors, the detective said. I know the weather, the fixer said, and I can tell when a storm will ruin everyone's picnic. You concerned about potato salad? I'm concerned about fallout that lands on innocent people, the fixer said. The men who arrange trucks and doors are at policy. They are implements. You don't punish hammers for architecture. You punish the hand that swings them, the detective said. A pause, a recalibration. Come by, the fixer said. Neutral ground, we'll exchange verbs. He chose a conference room in a building with a view of the river, and the habit of hosting negotiations that produce statements about moving forward. The fixer stood by the window like a man auditioning for a skyline. On the table, carafafes, copies of the framework, a box of pastries no one would eat. I can give you a name, the fixer said without preamble. One. Not upstairs, mid-landing. The kind who authorises emails to be written by other people. Villages where no one becomes ladyslick gowns and encourage oils in the air. He tunced a tiggen cowl touch but at vast and pidden into remounted angers, obviously. You can take recognising the ully upon the messes. A distinction, he said, that you understand the difference between civic maintenance and what happened in the courtyard, that you won't bury the former under the latter. The detective weighed it. Mercy isn't the opposite of accuracy. Say the name, he said. The fixer gave it, a deputy director of operations who attended ribbon cuttings with a look of focused humility and preferred phone calls to inboxes. The fixer outlined a meeting where schedules were reviewed and neighbourhood stress points identified language that would sound like blood pressure when read into a microphone. Why help me? the detective asked. Because quality of life, the fixer said, and didn't laugh. The city needs the maintenance. It doesn't need the choir to become the opera. You're not the conductor, the detective said. No, the fixer said. Just a guy who knows where the sheet music is stored. He took the name. He didn't sign anything. He didn't promise anything beyond the truth and his lousy handwriting. Leaving, he passed a hallway where a plaque listed donors, whose names felt like addresses. The city is a web of gratitude, with invoices. The deputy director didn't come quietly, but he came. A subpoena is a kind of prayer. He sat in a room with a microphone and a pitcher of water and answered questions with the stamina of a man who had trained in the sport of not say things. The detective watched from the back as counsel asked about frameworks and liaisons and mitigations. The deputy said collaborative 6 times. He said silo once, tragically. Then came the moment that rearranges furniture. A committee member held up the vendor list from the charity and asked why a P.O. Box cat was improving access across 4 neighborhoods. The deputy blinked. We rely on our partners to vet subcontractors, he said. And your partners rely on you to pay attention, the committee member said. The deputy glanced at the fixer in the audience. The fixer's expression was famous for not being expressions. The deputy drank water as if hydration were a defense. After the hearing, the reporter joined the detective on the steps. Middlemen on the record, she said. That's a headline that takes stairs. Upstairs we'll see they were in a different building, he said. She nodded toward the river. You can't indict weather, she said. But you can write about it. He went to Joe and Mary's because the end of a long day prefers a chair that knows your name. The room was busy in the way that makes restaurants immortal. The owner set down a plate the detective hadn't ordered, and a look that said, "This one's on the house, and on the house's heart." "How's the door?" the detective asked, because rituals are anchors. "It squeaks like it means it," the owner said. "People say it's music." "Choir practice," the detective said. They both smiled without needing to explain why. The night brought a message from his partner. The young guy with the too confident watch had been seen near the social hall taking out garbage after meetings. A useful detail. Every choir needs someone to fold chairs. The partner suggested a chat. The detective found the kid on a stoop, smoking ambition. "You decided to care again," the detective said. "I decided to practice a different hymn," the kid said. "One with fewer envelopes." "Tell me about upstairs," the detective said. "There is no upstairs," the kid said reflexively, then reconsidered. "There's a landing. Guys who listen to guys who listen. They love quality of life because it sounds like a blanket." He tapped ash into a cab that had known better seasons. "Blankets cover a lot." "Names," the detective said. The kid gave 2. Not famous, durable, men who chaired subcommittees and played golf with budgets. Men who could argue that trucks are a kind of kindness. Men who didn't dial phones, they were dialed. "Why tell me?" the detective asked. "Because the door squeaks again," the kid said simply. "Some things should produce." He went home through a city feeling slightly taller, like it had remembered a good posture. On his board he pinned 2 new names on the landing and drew a dotted line toward a floor he didn't need to see to know it existed. He wrote, "Maintenance versus Mercy." Then he crossed out VS and wrote "and." In the borrowed apartment above the hardware store, the 3 polite men were now practicing invisibility without rehearsal. They moved separately. They thought about the middle like professionals. One of them considered leaving town with the sincerity of a man rehearsing a lie. The other 2 liked the weather too much to relocate. At the charity, council drafted a statement about lessons learned. At the council office, calendars discovered caution. At the clubs, choir practice discovered private homes and the acoustics of kitchen tables. The city adjusted the way cities adjust by insisting it had always been this way. At Joe and Mary's, a family celebrated a birthday at the back corner table. When the cake arrived, the room applauded. The owner propped open the door for the candle smoke, and the squeak harmonized with the singing in a way that made 3 people wipe their eyes, for reasons that would sound foolish if explained. The detective sat at the counter, finishing coffee that had worked as hard as he had. The reporter slid onto the stool beside him, with a headline she couldn't print yet and a smile she could. "Quality of life," she said, toasting with her cup. "May it include honesty," he said, clinking. "And doors that complain," she said. Outside, the city took a breath you could hear if you lived here long enough. Buses sighed, a hydrant hummed. Somewhere, a saxophone insisted on 1958 again because some arguments are meant to be lost beautifully. The detective looked at the board in his head. Doors, trucks, permits, choir practice, liaisons, landings, a deputy who hydrated, a fixer who curated verbs, threads, knots, a pattern that wasn't art but would hold weight. He stood, left exact cash, and walked into a night that had decided to forgive the day enough to let tomorrow have a chance. Buildings don't brag about their landings. They brag about the lobby and the penthouse. But most of the actual living arguments, mail, decisions about shoes, happens on the landing. Government works the same. Upstairs has views, downstairs has keys, and the landing has clipboards. The morning began with clipboards. Our detective carried one into a conference room whose thermostat was set to respectable. The committee chairs, men from the landing, took their seats with the dignified discomfort of people who are used to being asked questions by anyone not in a tuxedo. Their suits were better than their sleep. The first name on the agenda belonged to a chair of a subcommittee on civic access and logistics, which is how you describe traffic when you want to invoice it. He adjusted his tie as if the knot could solve policy. Next to him sat his colleague from Neighborhood Safety Integration, which exists primarily to attend meetings titled Integration. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us," counsel said, which meant, "You are here. We are pleased. Do not attempt the fire alarm." "We're all on the same side," the chair said, which is a phrase that sounds nice right up until sides are counted. Our detective watched from the back and let the room do what rooms do. The chairs used paragraphs. Counsel used questions with handles. Who approved the framework that coordinated alley access, curb occupancy, and equipment staging with outside community partners' words? "The committee," said the chair, pleased to have remembered the script. "And who is the committee?" He listed names that sounded like insurance policies. The detective circled 2 that matched the kid's stoop confession. The landing, in full regalia. Door Services is listed as an access vendor in multiple neighborhoods, counsel continued. What verification did the committee perform? "We rely on partners," the safety man said. "Trusted liaisons. We don't vet cats." "Do you vet Trucks are the city's bloodstream," the chair said, having done the assigned reading. The room gave a polite laugh, the kind you give a man quoting a brochure. "And scheduling?" counsel asked. "Who decided on the time slots?" "A liaison proposed," the chair said. We concurred. The hours were convenient for residents. "Rivers, places, and views." "Lunch is a flexible concept," he said, then heard himself and regretted being alive that minute. Our detective read the mood. The landing was discovering that euphemism has a narrow spine when made to stand. He caught the fixer's eye across the room. The fixer's neat wrist was hidden, but his expression said, "You wanted the middle. Here's the middle." After the session, the chairs were escorted out by staffers who whispered in a dialect known as crisis management. The committee counsel approached the detective. "Progress," she said, in the careful tone of a person who deals in minor miracles and receipts. "Next, the deputy," the detective said. "He'll hydrate," she said. "They always do." He stepped into the hall for air you could return to. The reporter waited with a notebook that worked out. "They said lunch is flexible," she said, delighted and appalled. "I ain't eat that line for a week." "Don't choke," he said. She tilted her head. "Your landing boys are going to claim maintenance with bad optics. They'll say the choir didn't have sheet music. They won't say opera." "Opera is above their pay grade," he said. "They'll give you one wrong pot to save the rest," she predicted. The city's favourite hymn. He nodded, then checked his phone. A message from his partner. "Young guy with the borrowed watch is nervous enough to be useful. He has a bag of shredded paper and a guilty conscience." "Tell him shredders can be read," the detective replied. They met the kid in a coffee shop that served regret with foam. He slid a freezer bag across the table like a spy who had confused format with substance. Inside, cross-cut confetti in the colours of city stationery. "I panicked," the kid said. "Then I remembered you said doors should complain." "Shredders complain if you listen," the detective said. "You pull the pieces too fast," they scream. The kid stared. "Is that a metaphor?" "In this city," the detective said, "everything is." He took the bag back to the precinct and handed it to a technician who kept puzzle books in her desk for relaxation. She looked at the confetti like it had disappointed her, but might still try harder. "Give me a day," she said, "and a lamp." The detective made rounds. He walked the block around Joe and Mary's because street time counts differently. He timed the trucks that had legitimate reasons to exist. He mapped how a curb fills up and empties out. He watched a delivery guy balance 12 foil trays on one arm and navigate a door that squeaked without instructions. He watched the door watched him back in its way. The hinge told him, "I remember, but I won't talk. That's not what hinges do." Back at the precinct, the board had grown a spine. The charity's invoices formed a calendar. The club calendars lined up with the permit office's weekly rhythm. The deputy's hydration schedule matched the hearing schedule. The fixer's name lived where verbs belonged. The partner returned, chewing a pencil, in a way pencils resent. "Council office wants to know if cooperation includes immunity," he said. "Cooperation includes cooperation," the detective said. "Press wants a comment," the partner added. "Tell them the door squeaks again," the detective said. Evening brought a text from the technician. "Your confetti used to be emails, reconstructed 3 pages. One has a type column, another has liaison notes. The last says courtyard ready next to the date." She attached photos. The handwriting on the notes page had a familiar neatness. "Need wrist mead glue." He printed the pages and laid them next to the charity invoices, the curb permits, the framework. The shape grew muscle. In the notes, truck confirmed, door prep complete, lunch window optimal, choir standing by. He could hear the defense already. Lunch window optimal for maintenance, choir standing by for volunteers. There is a reason euphemism is the city's second language. He called the fixer and didn't bother with greetings. "Your wrist writes nice," he said. A pause, and then, "Detective, you know the difference between writing and authoring." "You signed the choir's attendance sheet," the detective said. "I signed the weather report," the fixer said. "You're the one chasing rain." "Come in tomorrow," the detective said. "Bring your verbs." "Will there be pastries?" "Only if you sing," the detective said. He didn't expect a confession. He expected structure. Sometimes that's better. Confessions wobble. Structure holds. He stepped out for air again and found the reporter on a bench negotiating with a pretzel. "You look like you nicknamed a piece of paper," she said. "I nicknamed 3, he said, and gave her the gist without the photos, because lines matter even when the day doesn't. "Tomorrow's hearing will hum," she said. "I'll bring extra batteries." "Bring patience," he said. "They'll try to outlast us with synonyms." Morning came dressed like an apology. Cooler air, a sky that didn't need to prove anything. The hearing room was standing room only, staffers, reporters, a few residents who had decided government was a spectator sport, and 2 men from the landing with faces that had tried sleep and failed. The fixer sat in the second row with a smile that paid taxes. Counsel began with courtesy and moved to Staples. "Deputy Director," she said, "do you recognize this schedule?" She held up a reconstructed page from the confetti, pieces joined with the care of a quilt. The deputy blinked. "Hydrated. It appears to be an internal coordination document," he said. "Meldon, for no perfect details, will be destroying telling you in a lean you gotta take some peril to took slowly houses and specialite it whole matty. Be sure to really be heavily bias." "It would have been prepared by staff," he said carefully. "We don't micromanage door lubrication." A murmur. The reporter's pen smiled. "And this note courtyard ready refers to what?" "Completion of access improvements," he said. "Safety features." "Safety for whom?" "For residents," he said, proud to locate that noun. "Riversets like Mr. Galante?" Counsel asked, letting the name arrive like a breeze that changes a room's temperature. Silence, the instructive kind. The deputy found the water again. "We do not coordinate with," he began, and stopped because the available endings were all bad. The fixer adjusted his cuff. Our detective watched the neat wrist and thought about Verds. The committee chair leaned into his microphone. "Deputy Director, the city will always perform maintenance. It will not underwrite choreography for unaliving. If your framework became a dance card, you will say so here." The deputy's face did that thing faces do when the future adjusts itself by half an inch. He didn't confess. He did the next best thing. "We allowed liaisons too much discretion," he said. "The framework was exploited." "By whom?" "By those who—" he began and again found a cliff. "By those who do not share our values." "Names?" He glanced at the fixer. The fixer was a statue of plausible deniability. "Names," the chair repeated. The deputy gave 2 landings names, the ones the kid had given. He added a third that made the reporter flinch in professional excitement, a scheduler in the council office with a talent for placing things on calendars and a brother who liked choir snacks. The room made a sound that polite rooms make, paper moving, breath caught. After the hearing, the detective walked out to the steps where weather can hear itself. The reporter joined him, phone buzzing like a festival. "He gave you the landing," she said. "You going to Clove?" "I'm going to measure the stair," he said. "Upstairs still says they were in a different building," she said. "That's fine," he said. "We're renovating the landing." He had no illusions. Upstairs continued. Upstairs always continues, but downstairs hinge, the door, the street, could be made honest for a while. Sometimes that's how cities define victory, not permanent, but repeatable. He took the afternoon to do something unfashionable in investigations, he said. "Thank you." He stopped by the technician's desk with a pastry that had earned it. He emailed the hygienic staffer a note that wasn't evidence but mattered. He went to Joe and Mary's and tipped with a generosity that felt like an argument. "How's the door?" he asked. "Rituals echo?" It squeaks when it should, the owner said. It's developed taste. Same, the detective said. The fixer called at dusk. You got your names, he said. I got the landing, the detective said. You won't get upstairs, the fixer said, taunting. They live in the weather. I live near the door, the detective said. A pause that felt like two men respecting their jobs from opposite directions. Detective, the fixer said, I didn't conduct this. You know that. I know you kept Ty, the detective said. Time is a kindness, the fixer said. To whom, the detective asked, is the question. They let the line go quiet and didn't ruin it with agreement. Night settled in the way New York does it, as a negotiation. The clubs were quieter, choir practice discovered calendars with fewer Thursdays, the charity announced a review of vendor practices, and retired door services with thanks for their commitment to access. The cat kept the P.O. box and decided to trust no one. On a stoop, the kid with the watch smoked one less. He had taken a job moving chairs at a place that hosted weddings. He said the pay was worse and the schedule honest. He said the music was loud but predictable. Progress, in this town, is sometimes a different kind of noise. The three polite men from the borrowed apartment read the weather report in separate places. One practiced a new route to a new door in a new neighborhood where the hinges hadn't learned his name. One considered buying a ticket to somewhere that had never heard of choir practice. One decided to wait and see, because patience had paid before. Our detective stood at his window, brick, a strip of sky, somebody's laundry practicing surrender, and let himself feel something like satisfaction, with a side of realism. He wrote on an index card and pinned it on his board where it would annoy future him with its earnestness. Make it harder to do the next one. He thought about landings, about clipboards, about the way cities survive by persuading themselves they can be improved by increments. He thought about a door that squeaked like a citizen. Before bed, he walked to Joe and Mary's to return the coffee mug he'd accidentally kept on a day the world was heavier. The owner accepted it like a sacrament. They didn't say we're good, they were. The street exhaled again, not dramatically, just enough to register. A bus sighed. A hydrant cooled a dog with poor judgment. Somewhere the saxophone argued for 1958 and lost with dignity. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, statements, editorials, and an email from someone upstairs expressing shock that stairs exist. The detective would testify, politely. The fixer would sit 2 rows back, politely. The city would nod as if it had learned something, politely. But tonight in Bushwick, a hinge chose to complain on schedule, and sometimes that's enough music for a block. In New York, a win is measured in inches. You don't conquer the city, you negotiate with it. You don't change everything, you move the furniture enough so that the next person doesn't stub their toe as hard. The detective woke knowing today was an inch-moving day. He dressed for testimony the way a man dresses for weather, appropriately and without delusion. The suit had attended hearings where people remembered selectively and forgot professionally. He tied the tie with the calm of a man who had learned to respect gravity's opinions. On the board, the threads had become lines. Door services retired with a fulsome thank you. The charity, cooperating with zeal, edged in self-preservation. The council office, discovering the difference between scheduling and choreography. The landing, on the record, blinking in fluorescent light. The upstairs continuing, as upstairs does, but with new caution carved into its calendar. He added one last note at the corner. Last inch honest door. He underlined it. He didn't regret underlining it. At the municipal building, the hearing room had acquired a personality. Staffers moved papers with purpose. Reporters carried the day like groceries. Residents, ones who had decided governing was a spectator sport, took their same seats, arranged their same snacks, and greeted each other like gym regulars. The fixer sat 2 rows back, neat wrist hidden, expression set to diplomacy. When the detective's name was called, he walked to the table and raised his hand, like a man who believed in the concept of oaths, if for the execution. He sat. The microphone hum became a presence. Counsel smiled the way a surgeon smiles at a rivet. Detective Counsel said, "Please describe in simple terms how a door squeak became a case." He did, the courtesy, the graphite, the truck, the curb, the framework, the choir. He explained how quality of life functioned as a blanket under which anything could nap, including choreography. He explained how permission layered upon permission produces secrecy by volume, not by shadow. He kept the tone calm, he kept the sarcasm dry. He used Unalive because language has schedules too. He did not name gods, he named schedules. "Did you find evidence that the city explicitly coordinated violence?" Counsel asked. "No," he said, "because accuracy is a tool. We found a system that could be steered by men who needed doors to behave." "And did it behave for them?" he said, "once." "And no. Now it squeaks," he said. There was a murmur, small, respectful. The room liked metaphors when they earned it. The committee chair asked about reforms. He offered 3 inches public logs for curb occupancy requests, independent review for access improvements, an end to unnamed liaisons moving trucks like chess pieces. He recommended Tibes windows friendly to residents and hostile to choreography. He suggested graphite purchases to be treated like fireworks, legal, reported, seasonal. "You want to regulate graphite," a member said, smiling. "I want to regulate courtesy," he said. "Courtesy used like camouflage." The reporter's pen approved. They asked about names. He gave the landing, already on the record, and declined to aim at upstairs rumours. He knew the limits of microphones and the appetite of weather. After, in the hallway with the honest light, the fixer stepped close enough to borrow the same air. "You were generous," he said. "I was precise," the detective said. "Precision is a kind of mercy," the fixer said. "Depend on the cut," the detective said. They stood for a moment, 2 men who occupied different jobs in the same city, exchanging verbs without witnesses. Then the fixer nodded once and left, walking like a man who understood that calendars are political creatures. Outside, the city tested autumn a few weeks early. A breeze lifted menus. A ladder leaned against a building for an honest reason. Someone walked a dog who had opinions about pigeons, and none about policy. The detective allowed himself a small exhale, and then did something unfashionable for a main character. He went to return things. He brought the graphite tin back to the club off Lorimer and set it on the shelf labelled door. Sal watched with a face built for disclaimers. "You keep souvenirs?" Sal asked. "Only when they're instruments," the detective said. Sal nodded, a concession in the language of landings. "We're doing a picnic," he said, "which in club means we will now be publicly harmless for 3 weeks. "Potato and macaronin," the detective said. "Unity," Sal said deadpan. He stopped next at the charity council, received him with hydrating earnestness. "We're implementing pre-clearance for all alley work," council said. "We're funding door repairs with squeak-positive outcomes. Doors that tell you they're doors," council said, almost smiling. "Put that on the banner," the detective said. He walked past the council office, where a staffer with civic hygiene stared into a monitor like it owed him a future. He left a sticky note. "Thank you for tidiness. It was not evidence, it mattered." The young man with the too confident watch had traded it for a wrist with a tan line and a new job moving chairs for weddings. The detective found him loading a van with white folding optimism. "How's the hymn?" the detective asked. "Louder," the kid said. "But at least it's the same song for everyone in the room." He looked healthier in the way that sleep is a vitamin. "You didn't take down upstairs." "Wasn't the job," the detective said. "What's the due, people?" "Make it harder to do the next one," the detective said. The kid nodded like a person being handed a small heavy object. "I can lift that," he said. At Joe and Mary's, lunch performed its ritual. Regulars, new faces, the back corner table reclaimed by daily life. The radio murmured baseball and mercy. The owner moved with a lightness that had taken a month to engineer. The door offered its squeak at key moments, entrances, exits, a kitchen kid sneaking a cookie. The room applauded it with casual affection. The detective took his usual stool. The server set down coffee and a plate that had not asked permission to arrive. He raised his cup toward the hinge out of respect for small victories. "How's the door?" he asked, ritual intact. "Fluent," the owner said. "Speak squeak and English." They shared a small, unremarkable laugh. Most expensive kind in this line of work. The reporter slid into the neighboring stool like a recurring character who had earned it. "Headline," she said. "City adds brakes to maintenance. Choir loses room. Quality of life discovers commas." "You'll bury that third line halfway down," he said. "Of course," she said. "But the people who read to the middle deserve a treat." They ate. They talked about nothing important and everything adjacent. She asked if he'd ever write a book. He said he already did, on index cards and corkboard, the only addition that mattered. She said that was the most detective thing anyone had said to her this month. He accepted the trophy. When he left, he walked past the back door and laid his hand on it. The hinge offered a ceremonial complaint. "Good," he said, and the door, being a door, said nothing profound. The three polite men, those who had rehearsed the alley into cooperation, were now weather. One had left for a city where doors are taller and fewer people know your name. One had found work unrelated to hinges but adjacent to exits. One continued in place because inertia is a credential. They would not be famous. Fame is upstairs. They would be footnotes. Footnotes are forever if you know where to look. The fixer remained the city's neatest wrist. He adjusted his calendar to include longer pauses between verbs. He offered a donation to a scholarship fund for kids who want to fix doors in ways that do not require euphemism. He emailed the detective one sentence. "We moved an inch." The detective replied, "Make it 2. Paper closed its migration for the day. Permits nested. Emails slept in their sent folders. A city clerk filed a form that would keep a truck from blocking an alley for no stated reason. Somewhere in a different room, a different committee tried a different phrase and decided it liked the way Sunlight Review sounded. Small changes, multiplied. That's policy, on a good day. He ended where all decent days in this story end, by the window with the stingy sky. He looked at the board and saw less drama and more structure. Names that had mattered, now taped at their edges, useful and finite. He took down one string and moved a pushpin and allowed himself the stern gift of closure without absolution. On the desk an index card waited for a verdict. He wrote, "The last inch is local." Then, underneath, smaller, "Keep it squeaking." He turned out the light. The city kept its own. Buses exhaled. A hydrant rehearsed October. From a window somewhere, a saxophone tried again to convince a night that 1958 was the correct answer, and the night, as always, disagreed politely. New York did what it does best. It kept the story going and left the door not quite closed. Just enough air, just enough music.